The truce between Israel and Iran appears to be holding for now, hours after President Trump accused both sides of violating the fragile ceasefire that he announced overnight. As he set off for the NATO summit this morning, the president swore in front of reporters as his frustration, particularly at Israel, boiled over. You'll hear in full what he had to say in a moment. Tonight, Donald Trump has been warmly welcomed in The Hague, where NATO leaders have sat down to dinner at the start of the two-day summit on defence. It comes, though, as questions are now being raised in the United States about just how successful the American airstrikes were on Iran's nuclear facilities. Here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
Israel launched a barrage of airstrikes on Tehran as the ceasefire deadline approached, also striking Iranian missile launchers in a last-minute all-out assault. Donald Trump was furious with both Iran and particularly Israel for not respecting the deal.
I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot.
We often see President Trump exasperated, but never actually swearing like this.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Understand that Israel has pushed him too far this time, just when he's on his way to take a victory lap at a NATO summit in The Hague, but only if the truce holds. He posted on social media, Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it's a major violation. Bring your pilots home now. Then from onboard Air Force One, in a call to the Israeli Prime Minister, which the White House described as exceptionally firm and direct, Trump demanded he stick to the ceasefire. And then posted again, while doing a friendly plane wave to Iran.
With a friend of mine.
The NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, is hosting to find the text he sent praising the President. Dear Donald, congratulations and thank you. It was truly extraordinary, something no one else dared to do. It makes us all safer.
About aggression by
On Air Force One, Mr. Trump is already talking about his desire to agree a ceasefire in Ukraine.
You know, I'd like to see a deal with Russia. Iran, I said, no, I don't need help with Iran, I need help with you.
Other NATO leaders, talking to them about spending more on their own defence, about Ukraine, and what he considers to be his crowning achievement in the Middle East. It's being reported here in America tonight that those American airstrikes on Iran might not have done as much damage to their nuclear facilities as Donald Trump claimed when he said they had been completely obliterated. An early Defense Department assessment that's been leaked says that the core components of Iran's nuclear program may not have been destroyed, that the country might only have been set back a few months, and that much of their enriched uranium stockpiles could have been moved to secret sites before the attack. Now, the White House are very angry about that. They've pushed back, saying this is flat wrong. The press secretary said everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their target. Total obliteration, she said. But they're not saying the Defense Department assessment is untrue.
Sarah Smith, our North America editor, thank you. Well, Israel and Iran had launched large-scale attacks at each other overnight. In Iran, targets were hit in the capital, Tehran, and in the northern region of Gilan, where local officials now say at least 16 people were killed. In Israel, the southern city of Beersheba was hit. 4 people were killed in a missile strike on a residential building. From Jerusalem, Lucy Williamson reports.
Beersheba was still a war zone this morning as Iran announced its commitment to peace. Rescue teams bringing out bodies from an apartment block hit in a final salvo of missiles, fired minutes before Iran agreed to the truce. One sliced through the walls straight into a bomb shelter, rescuers said, killing several people inside.
It's not about how many landed, it's why are missiles still being targeted towards civilian buildings like this?
There's meant to be a ceasefire this morning.
Well, You know, actions speak volumes, and this speaks for itself.
I think Israel need to hit back Iran because Iran kill people. Iran said peace, but there is no peace, no peace.
As we were there, another alert came in, warning of more missiles fired from Iran, after Israel had also agreed to the truce. But Israeli planes, on their way to retaliate, were called back home on the orders of Donald Trump. Tonight, Israel's Prime Minister vowed to act against any new nuclear threat.
All the actions that our fighters have taken have brought Iran's nuclear program to ruins. And if anyone in Iran tries to revive this project, we will act with the same determination and strength to end any such attempt. I repeat, Iran will not have nuclear weapons.
Iran still has the capability to fire missiles at Israel and has warned of a powerful response to any further attacks. The war has shifted power in Israel's favor, but tonight in Tehran, protesters called for their leaders to resist.
We must see it through to the end. There's no benefit in stopping now. Just like what happened in Gaza and Lebanon, Israel, America, and Trump himself cannot be trusted at all.
Iran will avenge the people you killed, said Suhaila. One day we'll catch you off guard. Be sure of that. In northern Israel today, a souvenir from 12 days of conflict. An interceptor used in Israel's air defenses. Israel says this short war has made the region safer by weakening Iran as a military threat. But it's weakened the regime as well. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Beersheba.
The United States and Iran have one of the world's most complicated and controversial relationships. The United States is the world's most preeminent superpower with a population of more than 320 million, while Iran is a major power in her own right, with a population of more than 80 million. These countries represent 4% and 1% of the living human population. And for the past 41 years, they've had absolutely zero diplomatic relations and have come close to the brink of total war on more than one occasion. At the beginning of 2020, war between the two sides seemed almost inevitable. The United States assassinated an Iranian major general in a drone strike, and Iran retaliated by initiating artillery strikes against American military bases across Iraq. Had a war broken out from there, it had the potential to become the biggest conflict in human history since the Second World War. This time, that fate was thankfully avoided. But in order to understand how it got so close and why it could still happen during another crisis in the future, you've got to understand the entire history of the conflict between America and Iran so far. And that story begins back before the start of World War II. At the beginning of the 20th century, oil was first discovered within the deserts of Iran by the British. As more and more of these discoveries were made, it was revealed that Iran in fact contained the fourth largest proven reserves of oil anywhere on the planet, and that the country was an undiscovered and unrealized energy superpower. The only problem for the British, of course, was that these discoveries were located within Iran, and Iran wasn't within Britain's vast colonial empire that already spanned a quarter of the globe. Not too worried about that pesky little detail, Britain negotiated a deal with Iran to share in the massive profits that were bound to come from the extraction of all this oil. They created the jointly owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, but it wasn't exactly set up very fairly. Iran, the country where all of this oil was actually located, was only entitled to 16% of the company's profits, whereas the other 84% of profits were going directly to the British. By the start of the Second World War, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company grew to control all of Iran's oil and had grown to become the largest company in the entire British Empire. But this massively valuable asset was coming under threats. Discontent at the company's unfair terms was growing within Iran itself, while at the same time in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and opened up the largest military front line ever seen in human history. Iran stood geographically at the Soviet Union's southern flank, and their intentions were considered suspect by both the British and the Soviets. Despite having declared neutrality at the onset of the war, Iran's ruling Shah, or emperor, was widely considered by the Allies to be too friendly firmly towards the Nazis. If Iran were to have cooperated with the Axis, it could have opened up another southern front for the Soviets to deal with that would have diverted vital troops away from the critical Eastern Front. It could have jeopardized the Soviet Union's own oil fields in the Caucasus right on Iran's doorstep, and it would have potentially placed Britain's largest oil company in the hands of the Nazis. So in order to prevent any of that from happening, and in order to ensure that Iran could be used as a transportation corridor to get vital supplies into the Soviet Union, neutral Iran was invaded by both the Soviets and the British. Vastly outnumbered and far behind in technology, Iran never stood a chance and surrendered within just a week. The old troublesome Shah was overthrown and replaced by the invaders with his much younger 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whom the Allies felt would be far less capable of acting against their interests. Iran was effectively occupied for the entire Second World War by the Allies, which eventually saw the deployment of more than 30,000 Americans and the transportation of nearly 1/3 of all the supplies that America sent to the Soviet Union. After the war ended, the Allies left and ended their occupation, but the unfair terms that the British had established in regards to Iran's oil came back into question. By the early 1950s, Britain was still taking home the majority of Iran's oil profits, while the conditions for Iranian oil workers and their families remained terrible. At the same time, the British were also withholding all of the company's financial records from the Iranians, and had refused all of their requests at being audited. The support for nationalizing the company within Iran was getting overwhelmingly massive, and by 1951, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, with unanimous approval from the Iranian parliament, finally did so. Britain responded to this by immediately embargoing all Iranian oil, and then 2 years later, in 1953, Britain's MI6 and America's CIA organized a military coup within the country to overthrow Mossadegh's government. As many as 300 Iranians were killed during the coup. Mossadegh himself was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, while the Shah was elevated to being essentially an authoritarian dictator within the country. Having had his position installed and guaranteed by Western powers twice now, the Shah became widely viewed in Iran as little more than a Western puppet. And as the Cold War developed out of the ashes of the Second World War, Iran's strategic location at the Soviet Union's southern flank, her vast strategic reserves of oil, and her authoritarian leader who owed his position and loyalty to the West, made Iran a natural and valuable ally of the United States for the very first time. The Shah pursued a staunchly pro-American and pro-Israel foreign policy, and for decades, Iran became one of America's most important Cold War-era allies. But over the decades, the Shah's policies and cozy relations with the West alienated much of his home base support. He ran a vast network of secret police within the country who arrested thousands of political opponents, and many more, like Ayatollah Khomeini, were exiled. Widespread torture of political dissidents in prison was reported. He outlawed the Iranian Communist Party. He continued friendly relations with both America and Israel, despite nearly none of the rest of the Islamic world even recognizing Israel, while he carried out a domestic policy of modernization, secularism, and the enfranchisement of women. All of these policies combined alienated Iran's leftists, the working class, and the hardcore Shiite Muslim conservatives and clergy, and by the late 1970s, Iran's long-standing political unrest had transformed into full-scale revolution. A movie theater was set on fire in Abadan that killed at least 420 people, with the Shah's regime blaming Marxist and Islamist insurgents, while many of the protesters felt like it was more likely the Shah's own secret police. The following month, protesters gathered in the capital Tehran's main square, and the Shah's army opened fire on them indiscriminately, killing and wounding hundreds more. More than 5 million Iranians took to the streets demanding the Shah's abdication, and after defections from his army became rampant, Mohammad Pahlavi realized that his position was impossible to maintain, and he fled the country in exile in early 1979. The new radical Shiite Islamist government that replaced the Shah's regime immediately abolished the monarchy and invited Ayatollah Khomeini back to the country after 15 years of exile to become Iran's new supreme leader, and the modern Islamic Republic of Iran was born. And this new Iranian regime was radically different from the one that it preceded. It was a totalitarian Shiite theocracy that was staunchly opposed to the United States and Israel, and mass executions and purges of political opponents and members of the former regime were almost immediately carried out. To the United States and the rest of the world, Iran's Islamic Revolution came as an enormous shock. Almost overnight, Iran had flipped from being one of America's most important Middle Eastern allies to her greatest Middle Eastern enemy. After the Shah was overthrown, the United States welcomed him into their country for a cancer treatment operation, and the new Iran demanded that he be extradited back to stand trial for the crimes that he had committed throughout his reign against the Iranian people. Knowing that his return would mean a certain execution, the United States rejected all of Iran's demands, but that did little to dissuade Iran's revolutionary paranoia. Since the Shah was actively inside America, and since Western powers had already initiated 2 previous coups in the past to install him over the will of the Iranian people, the paranoia was widespread that America and the CIA could be plotting yet another 3rd coup attempt from within their embassy inside Tehran. And so, in November of 1979, thousands of Iranian revolutionaries and students stormed the American embassy and took 52 American diplomats and civilians as hostages. America eventually sent the Shah away to Egypt, while the Carter administration worked for months to secure the hostages' release. But when diplomacy went nowhere, Carter authorized a raid by the United States Army Rangers in April of 1980 to attempt a rescue operation. But the raid turned into a disaster. Codenamed Operation Eagle Claw, a helicopter crashed into a transport plane before any contact with the Iranians was even made, and 8 American soldiers lost their lives. Carter ordered the mission to be abandoned, and the hostages remained under Iranian control. It was at this point that the United States decided to sever all diplomatic relations with Iran's new regime, and they have been frozen ever since. But a few months later, something else incredible and unexpected happened. In September of 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq launched an all-out invasion of conquest into Iran. For years preceding this, Saddam had wanted Iraq to overtake and supplant Iran as the dominant power in the oil-rich Persian Gulf. But they were never capable of doing anything about it, because Iran had a colossally larger military, and they had the support of America and Israel, all of which made her vastly more powerful. But after Iran was thrown into chaos by her revolution and regime change, with massive purges and executions of government officials, and after she was abandoned by both America and Israel and was left without any major foreign allies, Saddam calculated that now was better than ever to take advantage and attack. Iraq expected a rapid victory, but the war that followed turned into an 8-year-long stalemate that most resembled the Western Front of World War I. After the massive Iraqi invasion, Iran was forced to reevaluate the American hostage situation, and they agreed to release all 52 back into U.S. custody after holding them for 444 days. America levied heavy economic sanctions upon Iran as a consequence, and then began heavily supplying Saddam and Iraq in their war effort that they hoped would destabilize Iran even further. The Iran-Iraq War would ultimately prove to be one of the largest and the bloodiest of the 20th century's second half, with as many as 400,000 Iranians losing their lives across the front line, owing in part to the widespread deployment of chemical weapons and landmines from Iraq, who is being heavily supplied and supported with conventional weapons by the United States. Throughout the war, the U.S. contends that Hezbollah, a Shia Islamist militia organization operating out of Lebanon who is a client of Iran, carried out multiple anti-American terror attacks across the region. In 1983, they carried out a bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, which killed 17 Americans, and later that same year, they carried out another massive truck bombing attack against the barracks of a military compound in Lebanon, which killed a further 241 American and 58 French soldiers. These events and others contributed to the United States placing Iran on their state sponsors of terrorism list the following year in 1984. By April of 1988, the Iran-Iraq War was still raging, and Iran had mined a large section of the Persian Gulf in order to counter the Iraqi Navy. An American frigate who happened to be passing through struck one of these mines and became severely damaged and almost sank, but with no loss of life. Regardless, America decided to initiate a retaliatory attack against Iranian targets and initiated Operation Praying Mantis. It was the largest U.S. naval combat operation seen since the Second World War, and it saw 2 American surface groups launching coordinated strikes that blew up 2 Iranian offshore oil platforms and sank 6 of their warships. The attack destroyed or severely damaged half of Iran's entire fleet and killed 56 Iranians, while resulting in only 2 American deaths. Just 3 months later, in July of 1988, an American Iranian territorial waters and received warning shots fired in shoot-down incident in history until the horror of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine by pro-Russian rebels more than a quarter century later. These deadly events between both sides sharply escalated tensions between America and Iran, and each felt that the other had done grievous harm towards them. The administration enacted a total embargo on all dealings with Iran by both countries. In 1996, the Iranian client Hezbollah, and then 5 years after, in which he lumped Iran, Saddam's Iraq, and North evil conspiring against America. Just a little more than a year, the pretext of Saddam possessing weapons of mass destruction to invade Iraq and completely toppled his regime in around a month. No weapons of mass destruction were ever uncovered, and the message sent to both Iran and North Korea was clear as day. It was either develop nuclear weapons or you would be next. North Korea managed to successfully test an atomic bomb just 3 years after the American-led invasion of Iraq, while Iran hastily carried out their own nuclear weapons research as well. However, the United States made it clear that a nuclear-armed Iran would never be tolerated, and a combination of sanctions and diplomacy were used for years to try and convince Iran to stop. By 2015, the Obama administration had successfully negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known colloquially as the Iran nuclear deal. The treaty's terms are complex, but the TLDR is that the US agreed to end a sweeping series of sanctions they had previously placed upon Iran, while Iran agreed to give up their pursuit of nuclear research and allowed foreign inspections to routinely investigate them. Iran's and America's relationship was beginning to show some management. But then, things took another curve. Donald Trump was elected the new president. Iran nuclear deal, and to reinstate tough. Trump carried through with these campaign promises. Continue on with their nuclear program, and even close the which would have completely crashed the global oil economy. Worse the next year. In May and June of 2019, several were damaged in 2 separate violent incidents. The West blamed Iran, and then Iran denied all involvement. In June, Iran shot down an American drone that was flying over the Strait of Hormuz, and tensions increased even further. And then in July, an Iranian oil tanker was seized by the UK as it was passing through the Strait of Gibraltar on the grounds that it was shipping oil to the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, in direct violation of EU sanctions. Iran countered this by capturing a British oil tanker and taking its crew hostage as it was later passing through the Persian Gulf. Both sides eventually released the other ships and crew, but it was clear that tensions were reaching a boiling point. And then they dramatically escalated near the end of the year. On the 27th of December 2019, a rocket artillery attack from some assailant on America's K-1 military base in Iraq left 1 U.S. civilian contractor dead and 4 other soldiers wounded. America blamed the attack on Hezbollah and other Shiite Islamist militias supported by Iran, though both Hezbollah and Iran denied all responsibility. At this point, there were about 5,000 U.S. troops who were stationed in Iraq who were helping in the ongoing fight against ISIL, and 2 days later on the 29th, they decided to initiate a retaliatory strike against Hezbollah's weapons depots and command centers across both Iraq and Syria. These American airstrikes killed 25 Hezbollah-affiliated militiamen and wounded nearly 60 others. Escalating things even further a couple days after that, on December the 31st, Iran-backed militiamen stormed and attacked the United States Embassy in Baghdad. The embassy was heavily vandalized, but nobody on either side was killed, and the US blamed Iran once again for the provocation. And then came the 3rd of January 2020, when the already high tensions skyrocketed to levels never seen before. Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian major general widely believed to be the second most powerful figure within the Iranian regime, had just arrived in Baghdad on a flight. He was scheduled to meet with Iraq's prime minister later on in the day, but as he departed the Baghdad airport in a convoy of vehicles, a US drone that had been hovering nearby overhead fired a series of missiles that completely destroyed them. This missile strike had been personally authorized and ordered by President Donald Trump himself, and resulted in the deaths of Soleimani and 9 others. This event profoundly changed the crisis between Iran and the United States. It was the first time that America had assassinated a major military leader of a major foreign country since the plot to kill Isoroku Yamamoto of the Japanese Imperial Navy back in 1943, who had been the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attacks. 2 days later, Iran announced that it would no longer abide by any of the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal and demanded that Iraq remove all of the American presence from their country. And then, on the 8th of January, 5 days after Soleimani's death, Iran launched its own retaliatory strike against America. Codenamed Operation Martyr Soleimani, Iran initiated multiple ballistic missile strikes against 2 US military bases within Iraq, and the entire world held its breath. This was the closest that America and Iran had ever come to full-scale war, and the crisis could have easily escalated into that. America had already rapidly deployed thousands of soldiers to the Persian Gulf from the US East Coast in the days between Soleimani's death and this Iranian artillery attack, but thankfully, nobody was killed by it. The bases experienced significant damage to buildings and infrastructure, but everybody present remained alive. And this was sort of a godsend because it gave both Iran and America the opportunity to de-escalate without losing any face. Iran got to look strong and powerful by firing rockets at American targets, and without any casualties, America was given the option not to retaliate, which is what they chose to do. Unfortunately, though, tragedy still managed to find a way to strike. While Iran likely designed the attack intentionally to not cause any American casualties, Iran didn't necessarily know that the US wasn't going to retaliate, and their anti-air batteries across the country were on high alert for any kind of response. One of these missile batteries detected what they believed to be an American cruise missile on their radar, and they opened fire on it with 2 surface-to-air missiles. It turned out that the target wasn't a cruise missile at all, but was just a regularly scheduled commercial airliner that had just taken off from Tehran International Airport mere minutes before. The plane in question was Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, traveling from Tehran to Kiev with 176 people on board. The Iranian missiles completely destroyed the plane and killed everybody on board, including 82 Iranian and 63 Canadian citizens. Initially, the Iranian government denied all responsibility and attempted to cover the disaster up by blaming the crash on technical faults with the plane itself. But after raising suspicion when they wouldn't allow any investigators access to the crash site, the government finally admitted to mistakenly shooting the plane down a few days later on January 11th. That attempted cover-up sparked massive protests across Iran and against the regime, and the brink of war against the United States had just narrowly been avoided. Hundreds of innocent people died as a result of the conflict between Iran and the United States in 2020. But of course, it could have always been far worse. Had the conflict escalated by any number of countless different ways, all-out war could have broken out that would have resulted in the deaths of many, many more. I only hope that peace between my country and Iran can be maintained in the future, but at the same time, I'm aware of how precarious this peace is and the history behind all of this, and I'm fearful that one day in the future, we might not get as relatively lucky as we did at the beginning of 2020. This video was originally released on Nebula as a part of my exclusive Modern Conflict series nearly 4 years ago in September of 2021. A lot has happened between the United States and Iran since then, which is why I decided to release this video on YouTube now.
With Bernard Smith, our correspondent in the Jordanian capital, Amman. With Bernard Smith, our correspondent in the Jordanian capital, Amman. Bernard.
Yes.
Bernard, can you hear me? Bernard
we
Smith.
We just saw the end of one of the missiles, sort of heading towards the southern bit of Israel, passing over the top of Amman, as they do sometimes, although there was no alert over the city this time. Again, this is similar to Saturday. This is now, very early hours of Monday morning here. this is sort of a similar pattern, if you like, to overnight Saturday into Sunday, in which there were two separate waves in the overnight hours. The video you're seeing, yes, other targets hit across, other areas targeted across Israel. The Israeli military said that they put out sirens from about 4:10 local time, about sort of 10 minutes ago. The sirens first went off. They said the public is instructed to follow the instructions, request to follow the instructions of the Home Command. Also, it said the IDF emphasized not to publish and share the locations and footage of any of the hits. Israel says that we think about more than 200 odd missiles since Friday have come from Iran, been fired by Iran to Israel. Most of them get intercepted by either the Israeli Air Force before they hit Israeli territory, or some by the Jordanian Air Force, or others by Israel's Iron Dome protective system. But clearly, as we see from the videos, one or two, a few get through. Sometimes they're publicized because they land, as we've seen video from in the daytime aftermath of these hits. They cause devastation to some residential areas, and there have been casualties, 14 people killed in Israel since the first missiles were launched. But there is military censorship in Israel, as there is in many countries during times of war, because you're not allowed to publish if missiles hit on what might be deemed strategically sensitive or military sensitive sites. So we don't know exactly how many missiles get through, except that the Israelis say most of them are intercepted, but obviously some do get through.
And we're seeing pictures on our screen, live pictures of Haifa in Israel, where energy infrastructure has been hit. We're seeing at least, well, there seems to be at least 2 chimneys there in terms of that energy infrastructure that are on fire. We're seeing those blazes now after those missiles were launched, reportedly from Iran into Haifa, Israel, as well as other areas in Israel, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And it seems that the energy infrastructure is what has been targeted there. So not all of those missiles were intercepted by Israel's defense systems. Bernard, do we know any more detail about what exactly has been hit there? As I mentioned, we seem to be seeing on fire chimneys there, and as has been happening in the last 2 days, those infrastructure targets are what Iran has been going for.
Well, I guess some of the targets that Iran will be seeking out are in reflection of the targets that the Israelis have sought out in Iran. Israel has said that it has been striking, particularly today, it says, to degrade the Iranian regime's weapons production capabilities. It says it's been targeting the infrastructure of Quds forces, the IRGC, Iranian military in Tehran, and numerous weapons production sites across Iran. And it has been striking today, it says, surface-to-surface missile sites. Well, the Iranians say they are also targeting now in response. This has earlier been commented on, energy infrastructure of Israel. It's obviously, Israel is a much smaller country and more densely populated, and Haifa is strategically important port city where there is a refinery. And so if the Iranians are targeting energy infrastructure, then this would be a key target for them.
Yes, as you mentioned there, Bernard, it is a port city, Haifa, and we are seeing latest pictures now of more missiles being launched into this is the 3rd day of this escalation and what many analysts have been calling this tit for tat in terms of attacks between Iran and Israel. Israel has also indicated that this could continue for the next today, that they will give a powerful response. The Iranian president saying we will give a powerful response to any aggression may commit. And here it seems that they are barrage of missiles targeting energy infrastructure. That seems to be the latest of what we know at the moment, Bernard, that these three areas of Israel have been targeted. Haifa, the port city, strategically important north of the capital, Tel Aviv, and then Jerusalem as well being targeted.
Let's hear exactly what Donald Trump had to say just before he left that G7 summit in Canada.
I have to be back. Very important. I want to just thank our great host. Fantastic job. Thank you in Canada. I have to be back as soon as I can. We're going to have dinner with these wonderful leaders, and then I get on the plane. I have to be back early for obvious reasons.
Donald Trump there, where Ketavan Gordestani, then our international affairs editor, is with us here on set. Ketavan, tell us what the latest is on Donald Trump there and what he had to say, and also this joint statement that's now been issued by the summit.
Well, first of all, after he had left, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, seemed to indicate that Donald Trump was going back to Washington to sort of try to come up with a ceasefire proposal between and Iran. He said that to reporters, and just as he was getting on the plane, Donald Trump responded on Truth Social with some not very kind words for the French president in the Situation Room when he gets back to Washington, meaning that this might be something that is pretty big, but we don't know exactly at a time of rising conflicts. The fact that they a nuclear weapon, all of these things are things that they have civilians in both Israel and Iran. One thing that it was main source of regional instability, but there wasn't much mention of Israel. This statement pretty generic, even though the fact that it exists is already a pretty big deal. One thing to note also is that the fact that Donald Trump left to supposedly go and deal with the situation does sort of symbolize the fact that he believes he alone is going to deal with that situation rather than what we've seen in the past, which is that we are stronger together, especially in the G7. We're going to find a solution together with a consensus. He is definitely showing that it's America first, America alone, and they will maybe come up with a solution. But it seemed a little bit that he was wasting his time with the rest of the G7 and wanted to get back to the White House as soon as possible.
Yeah, Donald Trump there, as you say. We heard from Noga as well, the Israelis trying to get the US, if you like, more involved in the conflict. I mean, what is the US position at the moment, would you say? Which way is it leaning?
Well, there have been some mixed messages from the Trump administration on two elements about what comes next. One is where things stand with a possible nuclear deal. Donald Trump initially said that Iran should have made a deal. Then he warned the residents of Tehran to evacuate, even though we didn't know why he was making that announcement. But then he also suggested that a nuclear deal could still be done, and he is still considering, he just repeated that to reporters on Air Force One, that he's still considering sending either Steve Witkoff, his advisor, or the vice president, J.D. Vance, to meet with Iranian officials to continue those talks, even though that has yet to be confirmed. But it shows that he believes maybe that given the situation, Iran might be sort of forced into a possible deal because of the Israeli strikes. Then there's some mixed messaging on the question of U.S. involvement. We have seen that there has been forced deployment and strengthening in the Mediterranean by the U.S. Forces, but the U.S. is insisting that that's defensive. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said, "We are postured defensively in the region to be strong in pursuit of a peace deal." So far, they're insisting they're not getting involved. And Donald Trump was asked several times while he was at the G7 what would trigger the United States getting involved, and he refused to answer that question. There are two signs that he does not want to get involved or does not want to be dragged into a bigger war. One was that reported veto on the killing of the Iranian supreme leader, and the other issue that shows that he doesn't yet want to get involved is the fact that the U.S. is holding back that gigantic 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb and the aircraft that could carry that. They're not so far giving that to the Israelis. That would be what Israel would need in order to reach the deepest nuclear facilities in Iran. And that is in part because you have around Donald Trump people who disagree on what comes next with Iran. You have the hawkish wing that wants to help Israel actually finish the job in Iran. And you have the more MAGA wing that has campaigned all of those months and years on no forever wars, no involvement anywhere, especially not in the Middle East. This is not our problem, is their motto, if you will. And so Donald Trump is sort of back and forth on that issue. But I guess we'll see maybe later on today what happens once he's back in the White House.
Speak with Bernard Smith, our correspondent in the Jordanian capital, Amman.
The skies over both Iran and Israel may seem ignited by missiles, but there are already signs Iran's shooting fight is slowing down. It is believed to have had at least 2,000 ballistic missiles, but Israel's been targeting its stockpiles and launchers. So, by Sunday, day 3 of the conflict, Iran was already firing fewer at Israel. While Tehran has the largest number of ballistic missiles in the Middle East, it must still conserve. And some of what it's firing is landing. Israel's much vaunted Iron Dome system, highly effective against the slower and smaller rockets of Hamas and Hezbollah, is of limited use against Iran's ballistic missiles, which shoot more than 1,000 kilometers up before dropping to their target at supersonic speed or faster. Instead, Israel uses its Arrow system, designed with the Americans to intercept missiles outside the atmosphere. It's more than 90% effective, but each shoot-down can cost $2 million, and those interceptors are also in limited supply. This means strategically, Iran is choosing its targets carefully, and Israel may be choosing which missiles to intercept and which not to. Israel says it wants to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, to do that, it's been striking here, the above-ground fuel enrichment facility at Natanz. But fully destroying the one below ground is much harder. Then there's Iran's deeply buried enrichment facility, Fordo. For now, it is impossible for Israel to destroy it unless they can get inside. From the skies above, the only non-nuclear weapon which could destroy Fordo is a 30,000-pound munition called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Only the U.S. has that bomb, and the B-2 bomber aircraft needed to deliver it. So far, the Americans say they don't want to be involved in any bombing runs inside Iran. Iran, though, says it's moving the nuclear fuel there out. Were it to lose Fordo, it would likely mean an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions for years to come. Meanwhile, Iran appears to have lost control over some of its own skies. Israel has destroyed the anti-aircraft defenses inside Iran and has been flying its own fighter planes in without getting shot down. This is what's called air superiority.
Let's bring in Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Janice, Iran has also claimed that it is using a very powerful guided ballistic missile. That would be a munition we've never seen the country use before. What do you make of those claims?
I'm not wholly persuaded about that, Adrian, because we are not seeing a significant change in the rate at which these missiles are being intercepted. We should, if this was a hypersonic guided maneuverable solid fuel missile, and Iran has claimed all of that.
Okay. Interestingly, so we were watching Israel targeting Iran's nuclear projects. Is it your sense that that will make the regime in Iran slow down on nuclear development, or could it just mobilize it to try to move faster? Say, see, we're being attacked, we have to go faster.
There's no question it could go either way. It is entirely possible that Iran will rush to break out. It has moved some of that enriched fuel, it claims, to a secret location, and it could race to build a bomb and announce that it has done that, but it will not have the opportunity to test that weapon or to marry it with a delivery system.
So we know that Israel has targeted also nuclear scientists. Is there not a whole cohort of nuclear science students sort of waiting in the wings? I mean, that alone won't necessarily hurt Iran's nuclear program.
You are right. These are clearly the leaders of the program, but this is not novel technology, Adrienne, and there's a very rich, sophisticated scientific community in Iran. So I would not place a great deal of weight on that.
I guess what we know about wars is that they're really easy to start, less so, how they end, how you even know in a way that they're over. So I'm curious for Israel, what on earth is success or end game here?
A successful end would be that Iran no longer be permitted to engage in enrichment on Iranian soil. That's what they've asked for. The Ayatollah Khamenei has dug in repeatedly and said that Iran has that right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and he will not concede. That's the standoff that we're facing, and it is up to the mediators now to craft a solution that lets both of them off the hook.
Yeah, some dangerous days ahead. All right, Janice Stein, as always, thank you.
So welcome.
President Trump has approved plans for America to join Israel's attacks on Iran, but is said to still be making a final decision on whether to go ahead with that. Well, the BBC's US partner CBS News says it's been told by two sources that the US president is waiting to see if Tehran agrees to abandon its nuclear program. Well, I've been speaking to CBS News correspondent Jared Hill to get the latest developments from the US.
So there are a couple of things that we are learning from sources here at CBS News about President Trump's potential decision on what to do with Iran. One of the factors, from what we've learned from sources, is that it is dependent upon whether Iran, in some way, shape, or form, decides to abandon its nuclear program. Yesterday, President Trump said that Iranian officials had been asking to come to the White House to talk about this. Iranians, though, have said that they have not had any type of conversation about that, and so we still don't know what the truth is there. The Iranians are also saying that they don't plan on surrendering. The other factor here that we've learned is that President Trump is potentially waiting for more U.S. military assets to arrive in the region before he makes a decision on whether there will be some type of physical strike on Iran. We have seen some efforts from some Republican and Democratic lawmakers here in the U.S. on Capitol Hill in Washington, weighing whether they should push through a bill or a law that would prevent President Trump from acting on Iran without the approval of Congress. That is in the early stages right now, but all of this showcases just how divisive this issue is here in the States.
Indeed, and perhaps even divisive in his government, Jared, because we heard a couple of months ago from Tulsi Gabbard, who said something quite different in terms of how ready Iran was in terms of nuclear capabilities.
That's right. So the argument here is that all of this is happening because Iran, the argument again is Iran is incredibly close to enriching enough uranium to have a nuclear weapon. What we heard from Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, just in March, was that the assessment was that Iran was not close to having a nuclear weapon. President Trump, a couple of days ago, said he doesn't care what Tulsi Gabbard said. He believes, based on his current knowledge or intuition, that they are close to having a nuclear weapon. And so there is that division within the Trump administration itself on the intel.
Well, that's Jared Hill with the view from the United States as President Trump decides whether or not to join Israel in its military action. And we are getting some response on Iranian state media from Iran's deputy foreign minister, who said if the US wants to actively intervene in support of Israel, Iran will have no other option but to use its tools to teach aggressors a lesson and defend itself. Well, as efforts to de-escalate the tensions continue, the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy is going to be meeting his US counterpart Marco Rubio in Washington today. Well, earlier I was speaking to our political correspondent Joe Pike in Westminster to get more of a sense of the UK's position on all of this.
The UK's position is evolving because the key message of escalation we've heard from UK government ministers does not seem to be being heeded in the White House. David Lammy meeting over the UK's decision with some other nations like Australia and Canada to be involved. A lot of speculation around the UK military base at Diego Garcia, that's in the Chagos Islands in the centre of the Indian Ocean, because that's where it's certainly possible that American B-2 stealth bombers could launch from if they are to take action in Iran. Another possibility, of course, is the UK does what it did last October, which is shoot down missiles being fired from Iran towards Israel. The second big question mark for the UK government really is around the legal advice, and certainly echoes of the legal advice and the sort of debates over legal advice around the Iraq war 22 years ago. Suddenly the Attorney General, who's not a particularly prominent figure in UK politics, comes to the fore again in these sorts of discussions. Richard Herman's the Attorney General, and his legal advice around different sort of roles for the UK government will be fascinating. Number 10 saying to me today he's closely involved, but they do not want to comment on what that legal advice might be. One other key point I think it's definitely worth making, Regina, and that is around how people are feeling in the UK government, in particular in the Foreign Office. Diplomats do seem definitely anxious, not just anxious about avoiding an escalation in the Middle East, but also maintaining what so far seems to have been a pretty positive relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Starmer. There are UK diplomats and government sources within Number 10 who believe they've really aced the first 6 months of the Trump presidency. They point to this UK-US trade agreement, which is limited. It's not all enacted, but it has, they argue, tangibly improved the access to the US markets of some UK companies. And the UK got to the head of the queue with that. And therefore, there is this anxiety that relationship between Starmer and Trump, between Number 10 and the White House, between the UK and the US is maintained, whatever Donald Trump decides to do in the coming hours and days.
Well, that's Joe Pike in Westminster there. A short while ago, we brought you reports that foreign ministers from the UK, Germany, France and the EU were planning to meet in Geneva on Friday to have talks to de-escalate the situation. They were planning to meet Iran. Well, that's now been confirmed according to Iranian state media. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirming that there will be a meeting between him and European counterparts in Geneva. So, of course, efforts to de-escalate the situation continuing, and that is, of course, significant because it's European leaders.
Iran and Israel have again traded airstrikes overnight. The Israeli military has said it completed a series of attacks in the heart of Tehran in a post on social media. The IDF said its targets included an industrial complex used for making missiles and the headquarters of a research and development center for nuclear weapons. Iran has not commented on those overnight strikes. Its missiles targeted at Israel landed in the southern city of Beersheba, causing what local media described as heavy damage. Reports also said 5 people had been lightly injured. So let's show you the scene live in Tel Aviv at the moment. And we are monitoring these live shots and waiting for more information from the authorities and also news agencies around the world. Well, later today, European foreign ministers will meet their Iranian counterpart, Abbas Araghchi, in Geneva. They're hoping to try to de-escalate the crisis between Iran and Israel and find a negotiated solution which averts the threat of wider conflict. The talks involving foreign ministers of Britain, Germany and France, as well as the EU's foreign policy chief, come the day after President Trump's sudden announcement that he was delaying any decision on US military intervention. Earlier, Israel's defense minister said Iran's supreme leader can no longer be allowed to exist after an Iranian missile damaged a hospital in Beersheba in southern Israel on Thursday. Iran said it was targeting a military site nearby. Well, the North America correspondent Jake Kwan explains more about what options President Trump might have next.
This announcement of a 2-week deadline, I think there was a lot of speculation in Washington, as well as us watching, that perhaps America was very close to now deciding to take a direct intervention against Iran, perhaps striking Iran's nuclear facilities like the one in Fordo, where there is an enrichment plant deep underground where only America's bunker buster bomb could reach. But President Trump's this announcement that he will wait for 2 weeks to give room for negotiation until that decision is made, it really gives a great sense of relief for those of us who are watching, who believe that perhaps the decision was only a day or a few days away. At the same time, this 2-week deadline, it's now hanging a countdown clock essentially above this negotiation, above this conflict, and there's this sense that, previously there was no, there was no countdown. Previously there was just this kind of dark ambiguity of what's going to happen. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But now, the question is, if that clock runs out and there's no real deal with the Iranians, then what happens? Then President Trump may be compelled to take military action. Now, what we understand is that there are some robust negotiations going on. President Trump's special envoy to Iran issue, Steve Witkoff, is having direct phone calls with the Iranian foreign minister, as well as Europeans will be meeting with Iranians on Friday to work up some kind of deal that they can take back to Americans and say, hey, Iranians are willing to give up this much. Can we make that 2 weeks into 2 months and maybe 2 years? So that is really the diplomatic off-ramp that everyone involved here is looking for.
David Lammy, Britain's David Lammy, met with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio for those crisis talks a number of hours ago. What exactly came out of them? Because we have got the talks that are going to be taking place in Geneva later today, which I'm going to discuss with Kashaya. But what can you tell us about the Rubio-Lammy discussions?
So the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, was here in Washington earlier, and he met with his American Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as the Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff. And the three men essentially were discussing what is a deal that the Americans will be happy with, that they can agree on. And this is very important because, Secretary Lammy will be traveling to Geneva to talk to Iranians to get their idea of what the deal could be. And, the real challenge here, of course, is President Trump has already sort of vetoed the last time the Europeans have negotiated a deal with the Iranians, when President Obama and the Europeans, as well as the UN Security Council, had a deal in 2015 that the Iranians have accepted, where Iranians were supposed to give up their enriched uranium in exchange for sanctions relief. That deal, President Trump called it the most horrible deal. As soon as he was in the office, he scrapped that deal. And since then, the Iranians have been enriching uranium again. They said that this is for civilian usage. But President Trump, obviously does not believe that. So this is going to be a lot of convincing President Trump. And for Secretary Lammy, and the Europeans, really they have a big kind of task at their hands. But just the fact that this negotiation is now given room of 2 weeks. Secretary Lammy was really hitting a hopeful note today in the readout of the meeting, saying that, there's now a chance to stop the world from sliding into a bigger conflict here.
And that was Jake Kwan. Kashaya Junaidi is from BBC Persian, part of BBC World Service, also in Washington for this particular story. And Kashaya, just first off then, let's just pick up on those talks that are coming up, being held in Geneva with the EU and also Iran and EU leaders, rather. The UN is not going to be taking part. They have commented. But how seriously should we take the comment from President Donald Trump that there is a substantial chance of negotiations and possibly a deal?
Well, the Iranian side is looking to have a diplomatic outcome to this war, a diplomatic solution that could stop the war and stop the pressure that Israel is inserting on the regime. So they would try to find a way to finish this war without with a diplomatic solution. So that's why they're going to meet today in Geneva with the Europeans. And on the other side, Reuters was reporting yesterday that Steve Witkoff, the American envoy for Middle East, has talked to the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi after the war has started. And accordingly, Iranians have showed the willingness to show some flexibility in the nuclear talks as long as Israel stops the attacks. So, of course, the Iranians have said there will be no face-to-face meeting as long as with the Americans, of course, as long as the war continues. But they're hopeful that they could find a window of possibility that Israeli attacks would stop without the U.S. getting involved militarily in the war, so they could find a settlement. And of course, because all the pressure, all the blows that have been, all the hits to.
Let's go ahead and revisit exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social. We have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordow. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter. All right, Hamda Salhoud's joining us now from Jordan's capital. She's in Amman because Israel's government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel and the occupied West Bank. So, Hamda, we've...
Iran and Israel.
For negotiation. Look, the moment that this
to enter this war, and there is a reason for it, because first of all, there are different Shia militias in Iraq. Some of them are more loyal to the Iranian regime, some less. But for all of them, they risk entering this war. They would risk like losing U.S. support for the Iraqi economy, and the Iraqi economy would be under a lot of pressure if the U.S. withdraws from supporting it. And the Iraqi army will also the Americans will stop supporting the Iraqi army as well, and that will be a severe blow to the Shia majority in Iraq. So they are not really that inclined to get into this conflict. On the other side, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, a major leader in the Shia world who resides in Iraq, has also warned the Americans about attacking Iranians. But this has been more like a warning, and we haven't seen the militia in Iraq entering this phase of war to support Iran.
Okay, Kashaya, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, speaking to the BBC on Thursday, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister warned President Trump not to get involved in the conflict.
We are on diplomacy. And but until this aggression continues under this bombardment, under these brutal atrocities that is happening against my country, nobody can go for negotiation. Look, the moment that this aggression stops, of course diplomacy is the first option. But now what we are seeing and what we are hearing from Americans, that they are thinking of getting involved in this war. We think that this war is not American war, but if they would like to get into this war, President Trump will be remembered forever for a war that it was not his war, but dragged in. And this will be a quagmire, and this will be hell for the whole region.
But isn't this a big risk
Isn't this a big risk for Iran? Iran is no match for the world's biggest military power, and the people of Iran are already suffering enormously.
Look, when there is a foreign aggression, there is a national unity, and what you are seeing right now is this exactly national unity which is happening inside and outside Iran. This is not a matter of who has the superiority in hard power. This is a matter of resistance.
OK, let's speak to our correspondent, Dan Johnson, who's in Jerusalem for us. Hello there to you, Dan. I wonder, first off, any more detail you can tell us about these strikes across southern Israel from Iranian missiles?
Yes, we know that missiles were fired from Iran towards the Negev region of Israel early this morning, and at least one of those missiles has got through and has hit a technology park in Beersheba, the sort of place that there are offices for Microsoft and other international companies. There are fires burning there. We've seen some video from the scene that shows a number of fires on the ground being tackled by firefighters. There are paramedics responding to that scene as well, because some nearby residential buildings have also been damaged, and at least 5 people are reported to have been wounded in that missile strike early this morning. That is the same area that the Iranians hit the hospital yesterday, where lots of people were injured. It looks like, they said yesterday, they were trying to target the technology park when they hit the hospital. It looks like they've gone back to that target today and have hit it once again. So that underlines to people just what the sort of risk is as this conflict continues. There were further Israeli airstrikes overnight on the Iranian capital and on Iran's nuclear research organization's headquarters. And the hope is that with the talks happening in Geneva today, that this sort of exchange of firepower will come to an end. Donald Trump's laid out this 2-week window for negotiations for talks to take place, and the first step on that road to any sort of peace deal is the talks that the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy is involved in today in Geneva with his Iranian counterpart, supported by the German and French foreign ministers as well. But on the ground in Israel, just those strikes in the south of the country and at least one missile that has got through. The fires are still burning there. The emergency team still responding at that scene in Beersheba.
Dan, obviously Mr. Netanyahu has been commenting on the possibility of the US joining this war. He has said they can go ahead without the US. Can they really?
They can continue doing what they've done for the last week or so, firing missiles at various Iranian sites, mostly linked to its nuclear program. But there are certain sites within that program that Israel suspects of being key to the Iranian nuclear weapons ambition that are in bunkers tucked away in mountains, and that is where the Israeli firepower cannot reach. That is why the Israelis, if they really want to attack those sites and negate any threat from an Iranian potential nuclear weapons program, they need those heavier US weapons to reach those sites and to make sure they could be destroyed. That is why Benjamin Netanyahu has been seeking the support of Donald Trump, who could supply those weapons. But Donald Trump says that he is hoping in the 2-week window that he's leaving now before he makes that decision whether to go ahead with the plan that has been laid out. He is hoping that the Iranians will seriously negotiate to come to some sort of deal to reassure the Israelis that there is no threat to them from this nuclear program that Iran is accused of running, not just to power the country, but also to threaten Israel and some other neighbours. So that is the sort of discussion that will be started, hopefully, today by the foreign ministers who are meeting in Geneva. But that would only be the first step. There would have to be different rounds of talks involving different levels of leadership, politicians, military commanders. What sort of a deal we could be talking about is a big open question, and how serious the two sides about actually reaching some sort of negotiated deal is an open question. The Israelis certainly want to continue firepower to take out the Iranian nuclear program. That is their preferred option, but Donald Trump is seeking a negotiated settlement instead.
Dan Johnson, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and revisit exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social. We have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordow. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter. All right, Hamda Salhoud's joining us now from Jordan's capital. She's in Amman because Israel's government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel and the occupied West Bank. So, Hamda, we've known for a while now that Israeli officials have been calling on the U.S. to support their efforts, their conflict with Iran. Now we have confirmation from the U.S. president, from Donald Trump, that the U.S. has struck 3 nuclear sites inside of Iran. Are we hearing anything from Israel at this stage?
Well, we aren't getting much from Israeli officials just yet because it is late, around 3 a.m. local time. But look, let's just give you some background and some context. Since Israel decided to attack Iran 9 days ago, they had been saying that they do want the Americans to get involved in this. This is what was being pushed in Israeli media. There were banners that were being put up across places in Israel, unclear by who, calling on President Trump to, quote, finish the job. So it's important to note also that within the last day, reports have emerged of Israeli officials having a call with people in the Trump administration, but not President Trump himself, that Israel was growing impatient with the U.S. not deciding if they were going to get involved or not, that they didn't want to wait 2 weeks, this 2-week deadline that President Trump had previously given, that the Israelis were considering attacking the Fordo site on their own. But it's worth mentioning that this is a site that's, 1, incredibly secretive, 2, mainly underground, and 3, it's deep in the mountains. It's dug up in the side of a mountain. So the Israelis didn't even know if they have the capabilities to do that, which is why they wanted the Americans to come in with their weaponry, with their bunker-busting bombs to attack this site. So the Israelis were considering doing this already on their own. Netanyahu said that it was not off the table once Israel started striking Iran, but they were still waiting for U.S. support. And Netanyahu had said while visiting a building that was struck by an Iranian missile that this war would continue with or without the American support, with or without the American weaponry that could be dropped if they continued, or they considered rather, conducting their own airstrikes. But this is something the Israelis wanted from the very beginning. Both Israel and the United States have said that they don't want Israel to acquire a nuclear weapon, and they don't want Iran to have any sort of capability to enrich uranium, which is what they're doing primarily at this nuclear site and sites that were struck. So this is surely going to be received well in Israel as part of their prolonged campaign, they say, against Iran.
Hamda, just stay with us for a moment, if you will. On your screens right now, you can see the 3 nuclear sites that President Donald Trump says the U.S. has attacked. U.S. forces have hit Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The Natanz site is Iran's main uranium enrichment site. Fordo is another facility where nuclear fuel can be purified, and Isfahan is a site that Iran uses to convert uranium. Now, Hamda, with regard to Israeli officials, as you mentioned a moment ago, we know that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as other government leaders in Israel, have indicated that they were going to continue attacking Iran whether the U.S. entered the conflict or not. Now that we know that the U.S. has entered the conflict by targeting these 3 sites in Iran, is there any indication from what we've heard from Israelis in the past week or so what they would do if the U.S. enters this conflict in essentially just one type of strike and then comes out of it? Would they continue then attacking Iran? Have they said they would continue? Or would they consider potentially stopping and seeing what the U.S. might want them to do going forward?
Well, there hasn't been anything specific in terms of what the Israelis would do if the Americans conducted their own strikes. But if you know anything about the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and their conduct in these recent wars that they have started within the last several years, they say that they're going to continue until, quote, the job is done. This is something Netanyahu himself has said. All of his defense ministers, his army chiefs of staff, that they have a job to complete, whether that was in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the occupied West Bank, and now now in Iran, which is why military officials have said that this is going to be a prolonged campaign based on the information they have, based on the sites that they want to attack, and also based on what they regard as success within the first 9 days of the attacks across Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu has said that for some time this was on his mind. This is something the Israelis have wanted to do. And his army chief of staff, while speaking was on his mind. This is something the Israelis have wanted to do. And his army chief of staff, while speaking yesterday, had said that while this will be a prolonged campaign, it's because they say Israel had intelligence about Iran reaching some sort of point of no return with uranium enrichment and with the acquisition of an entire nuclear weapon, which is why they decided to move forward with those strikes at that time, even though it was something that had been planned. There was something in the works with the Israeli military for years prior. This is a conversation that the Israelis have been having for a long time. It's nothing new within Israel. And remember that Israel largely accuses Iran of arming and supporting other sorts of groups throughout the region like Hamas and Hezbollah, saying that this was also part of the reason that they wanted to attack different strategic military and nuclear facilities inside of Iran. But the military has said in the last couple of days that their work isn't finished, meaning that they're trying to destroy all of the weapons capabilities as well. The Israeli army says they've destroyed at least 3 Iranian fighter jets, as well as nearly 1,000 drones and other sort of ballistic missile capabilities and different arsenals that are across the country. So Israel says they're still going to continue doing this. This has been something on their minds, these types of strikes that they have wanted to conduct. And there are mixed reviews within Israel about how Israel is going to proceed moving forward, how the government is going to handle yet another war that has been started by the government. So moving forward, you can surely see Israeli government support for the American involvement now in this war. But it'll be interesting to see how the Iranians will respond to this, what type of attacks they'll conduct in retaliation, not just towards Israel and towards places like Tel Aviv, but also against perhaps American targets in the region.
All right, that's Al Jazeera's Hamda Salhoud joining us from Amman. Thanks so much, Hamda. Joining us once again now in the studio is our correspondent, Dorsa Jabari, who's reported extensively from Iran and on Iran over the years. Dorsa, are we hearing anything new from Iranian officials at this hour?
No, we haven't heard any reaction or even confirmation that these strikes have taken place. The only information that is being shared on the social media channels belonging to official and semi-official news agencies inside Iran, they're just quoting Donald Trump's Truth Social post. There has been no reaction or confirmation even from the Iranian side.
Dorsa, you were speaking earlier specifically about those sites that have been hit and targeted by the U.S. I wonder if you could just bring our viewers up to date as to where Iran's nuclear program and where the nuclear sites were as far as their capability in the run-up to all this in the past week after Israel started attacking and before the U.S. entered the fray.
Well, Iran has 6 nuclear facilities across the country. The 3 that were hit this evening by the Americans they're the 3 most critical components of Iran's nuclear program. The site in Natanz, it is the biggest facility they have. It is home to the biggest part of the nuclear program. They have the most centrifuges, and it is one of 2 facilities that enriches uranium. The other site is Fordow, that is near the city of Qom. This is the 2nd enrichment facility that Iran has in its nuclear program. These 2 sites were enriching uranium at 60% levels. Isfahan facility is also another critical component in the program. It is a uranium conversion facility that also stores most of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile. According to the latest report by the IAEA, Iran has about 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium at 60% that they have kept inside the country, and it is believed that this is where it was stored. So these 3 locations that the American president claims they have hit is critical. But one thing we have to remember, of the 6 facilities, 5 of them, these 5 sites have already been targeted by Israeli airstrikes. Now, Fordo, because of the way it was designed, it's about 80 meters deep underground, the facility. The attacks Israel has carried out, and this is according to the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, they have been in and around Fordo, not directly at Fordo. So we know that the Israelis, both according to the IAEA and the Israeli officials and the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, they have targeted Iraq heavy water reactor that has not been operational for years since the 2015 nuclear deal was signed. It went offline as a part of that agreement. They targeted the Tehran nuclear research reactor as well. They have targeted Natanz a number of times. This is the Israelis prior to this attack by the Americans. They have also attacked Esfahan facility, and they attacked, or they tried to attack Fordo. So 5 out of 6. The only nuclear facility that has not been targeted inside Iran is the Bushehr nuclear power plant. This is a facility that is in the southern part of the country, and it has. And one of the reasons many people have been speculating catastrophic for
Joe Castro in Washington, D.C. Heidi, what else are we hearing now from U.S. officials or from U.S. President Donald Trump when it 3 nuclear facilities in Iran?
Well, Mohammed, now Donald Trump has taken to Truth Social again, announcing that he will be addressing the American public about these U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear sites in about an hour and a half's time. He went on to say this is a very successful military operation in Iran. This is a historic moment for the United States of America, Israel, and the world. Iran must now agree to end this war. Thank you. Those word for word from his latest Truth Social post. And so when he does speak to the American public during prime time in about a little over an hour's time, he will not only have to be explaining these strikes, but as well as trying to sell it, really, that it was a good idea to the American public. You know, this is the first time that the U.S. has directly bombed Iran, a major infrastructure, since the Iranian Revolution. And this is something, in fact, that a series of American presidents from both parties have tried to avoid up until this point. Donald Trump is calling it a historic moment again. He says not only for the U.S., but for Israel and for the world. So certainly trying to sell this as having made the right call. That is also being echoed by some of his supporters, including Senator Lindsey Graham, who is an Iran hawk, saying that this was the right call on X. But whether or not the U.S. public believes that as well remains to be seen. They were really mixed going into this. There was sparse polling before this action was taken on whether the U.S. should directly strike Iran. And the Washington Post conducting a poll finding that most people who answered that said that the U.S. should not be taking this route because it would be opening a new dangerous phase of the war. Many Americans, though, 30% at that time, said they simply didn't know. This is not something that's been top of mind for the U.S. public. So much other domestic headlines taking that attention away. But now, front and center, as Trump will talk about this directly to the American public in about an hour and a half.
Yeah, Heidi, and as you mentioned, there has been this growing divide within Donald Trump's base, some who are isolationists and some who wanted to see an attack on Iran, and this debate going on within the administration as to what was the best course of action. I want to ask you specifically about another debate that's been going on inside the U.S. the last several days, which is if Trump actually had the sole authority to launch military strikes on Iran, because there are many who say that Trump would have needed approval from Congress before taking this kind of action, right?
Right, especially now that this could be seen as a declaration of war, which is the sole power of the U.S. Congress, if you read the Constitution strictly. However, historically and in practical terms, U.S. presidents in the recent past have taken have warranted U.S. military strikes on foreign targets in the past without consulting Congress. Congress was in the middle of perhaps taking action to try to prevent this, but a few voices of dissent among Republicans saying that this was not our war, not the U.S.'s war. Obviously, Trump beat them to the punch, in fact, surprising almost everyone, given that he had initially said that Iran would have up to 2 weeks time to come back to the negotiation table, find a diplomatic solution, and avoid a direct airstrike from the U.S. And then for this to happen just days into that window certainly also cut off much opportunity for dissent among his own party and within his own country.
All right, Heidi, stay with us. That's Heidi Jo Castro out of Washington, D.C. for us with all the latest. We'll be coming back to you. Let's go now to Bill Courtney. He's a former U.S. ambassador and nuclear negotiator. He's also an adjunct senior fellow with RAND, which is a nonprofit think tank. He joins us now live from Washington, D.C. Bill, thanks for being with us. Let me ask you first, when it comes to what's just happened, this confirmation from U.S. President Donald Trump that the U.S. has struck these 3 nuclear facilities in Iran, what does that do when it comes to the geopolitical situation going forward, when it comes to regional tensions? How do you foresee all this playing out?
It's a bit early to foresee those sorts of things, but it's important to realize that for several decades now, the U.S. and the West have sought to get Iran to end its nuclear weapons program, its enrichment program. And while in 2015 there was an agreement that might have slowed it down, it held no prospect to end it. So President Trump has taken an action really seeming to aim to do something that could bring it into the program, although more will be required than this.
Bill, you say that this action, at least is being seen by the administration, that it would bring an end to some of these problems. But the Iranians have said over and over again that if Washington were to join the conflict, that would have severe repercussions. I mean, what is the situation when it comes to U.S. credibility in the Middle East right now and concerns about its credibility going forward?
So there will be in the Middle East a number of people who are outraged that the U.S. is once again engaging in a Middle Eastern war. But for those who are concerned about Iran's nuclear breakout potential, such as the Saudis and some other countries in the Persian Gulf, they will see now U.S. power as more credible and more apt to be relied upon than in the past.
Bill, you had a situation in the past few days where you essentially had a U.S. President, Donald Trump, rebuking the head of his intelligence agencies, Tulsi Gabbard. You'd had Tulsi Gabbard testify a few months ago that the assessment was that Iran was not trying to build a nuclear bomb. Trump was asked about that in the run-up to these strikes, and he said that he didn't believe that was the case. When you have this play out publicly, a sitting president questioning and then denying, essentially, the assessment from his spy chief, I mean, what does that say about the inner workings of the government in Washington?
Well, it suggests there may have been other factors at work beyond the intelligence assessment. You know, in some sense, let's remember that we're talking about enriching uranium. The U.S. dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima in 1945 and did not need to do testing, nuclear tests before that. So it is possible that the Iranians, if they have highly enriched uranium, and that can be available to them sufficiently high at 90% in just a couple of weeks, the Iranians might be able to put together a bomb without testing it.
Bill, are there any indications coming out from what you're seeing right now from the statements from Donald Trump and potentially others in the administration? We know that Donald Trump is going to be giving an address to the U.S. in a little over an hour from now. At least that's what he's announced. But based on what you're seeing thus far, is there any indication that the U.S. plans to continue bombing Iran, or at this stage does it look like this was a one-and-done operation?
It's too soon to tell. Partly it will depend on whether Fordo was fully penetrated. Each B-2 bomber flying from Diego Garcia could carry 2 of these 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators. Fordo would have required more than 1 or 2 probably to be fully destroyed. So we'll have to see what is the battle damage assessment from this strike on Fordo, and that could have something to do with whether the U.S. continues a bombing effort.
All right, Bill, just stay with us. We're going to come back to you with more questions shortly. Right now, I want to go back to Dorsa Jabari, who is joining us here in the studio. She's our correspondent who's reported extensively both from Iran and on Iran in years past. Dorsa, this is a moment that many were questioning if it would happen. We know now that the U.S. has bombed 3 sites in Iran. What were we hearing from Iranian officials before this action was taken as to what the repercussions might be?
Well, we had heard from the Iranian foreign minister, we had heard from the Iranian president, we had heard from Iranian military officials who had reiterated over and over again, if the United States gets directly involved in this conflict, then the U.S. military bases in the region, in the Middle East, will become legitimate targets for Iran. Now, the United States has about 40,000 military personnel in this region, and they have 19 military bases, 8 of which are permanent. These military infrastructure and facilities are what Iran will now call legitimate targets as a result of what the United States military has just carried out in Iran.
And Dorsa, we've seen now that U.S. President Donald Trump has also posted on his Truth Social account, Iran must now agree to end this war. But certainly, in the run-up to all this, what we've heard from Iranians is that if the U.S. were to get involved, that's only going to escalate the situation. How do you foresee the Iranians reacting to a message like this?
Well, this is going to be seen as yet another attempt by the United States to negotiate or to force Iran to come to the negotiating table through force. And they've said that even the discussions between Iran and the United States will not continue while Israel is bombing Iran, because they held the United States accountable for Israel attacking Iran from June 13th. So even before the United States was directly involved, the Iranians blamed them for being indirectly involved, having given the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, the green light to start attacking Iran. So Iran is going to see this as an act of war. It's going to be very difficult for anyone to convince Iranian officials to see any kind of an off-ramp from full confrontation between Iran and the United States.
Yeah, Dorsa, when it comes to diplomacy, obviously we know that will be tricky. It's been tricky up to this point. It would certainly be trickier going forward. When it comes to any type of off-ramp to this conflict, is there any scenario by which any international actor might be able to try to de-escalate this situation right now?
I think we've crossed those lines. I mean, things have happened in Iran that nobody even imagined would happen. Israel attacking energy infrastructure, nuclear facilities, assassinating nuclear scientists, all the top level members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. These were all acts carried out by Israel inside Iran without any prior warning. So any kind of a political off-ramp is very, very difficult to see now. But of course, diplomacy is never dead completely. There's always hope for diplomacy. And it is now going to be up to the regional countries to really step up and try to mediate some kind of a resolution in this conflict, because it is no longer just Iran and the US and Israel. The entire region is at risk.
Doris, in the last couple of hours, you were on set with me and you were describing the mood in Iran. We were playing sound bites from some of the people who'd been injured in those strikes by Israel in the last week. I'm curious if you could tell our viewers about what the sentiment has been, what you've been hearing from your sources on the ground as to the mood, how concerned people are, both when it was just Israel attacking Iran and in the run-up to the potential of the U.S. attacking Iran, which now we know has happened.
There was a lot of fear and anger, but there was also unity. The fear was about not knowing what they could do. The general public, this is a country of just over 90 million people, the general public really were not prepared for this kind of conflict. The last time bombs dropped on the capital, Tehran, was during the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. And it was not even close to the scale of what we're seeing now and how fast Israel and continuously has been attacking various positions in Iran. So people were not really prepared on any level. So it came as very much a shock and surprise. And then there was anger about how this could have happened. The international community remained completely silent. All the Western countries have yet to even condemn Israel's acts in Iran. So there was a lot of anger, and this has united the country. The general population, whatever differences they may have had from whichever side of the political spectrum they sit on, these events of the past 9 days has really rallied the national interest, the feeling of this is a nation at war, and people need to rally behind the flag in order to get through it, and that is what we've seen.
All right, Dorsa, stay with us. We're going to come back to you for the moment. That's Dorsa Jabari, our correspondent, live on set with us. We'll be coming back to you shortly. Let's revisit now exactly what U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform, Truth Social. We have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordow. All planes are safely on their way home. Congratulations to our great American warriors. There is not another military in the world that could have done this. Now is the time for peace. Thank you for your attention to this matter. All right, let's go back now to Bill Courtney. He's a former U.S. ambassador and nuclear negotiator. He's also an adjunct senior fellow with RAND, which is a nonprofit think tank. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Of course, a lot of moving parts right now, Bill. The president, Donald Trump, has said that he's going to be addressing the country in the coming hour. Obviously, this is a time of, some would say, political peril for Trump because there is a split amongst his base, some with more isolationist tendencies that did not want to see him enter the war in Iran, others that did want to see him go to war in Iran and attack nuclear sites. What do you expect we might be hearing from Trump in the hours ahead?
President Trump will likely want to recount what happened, probably provide a bit more detail about what has happened, and try to rally Americans around to the idea that, this is something that was necessary. It had to take place, and only the U.S. could have helped destroy the Fordow complex deep under a mountain. I don't know how much history he'll talk about, but it is useful to remember that both North Korea and Iran were rogue nuclear states. But the West did not feel it could attack North Korea's nuclear program militarily because North Korea had so much conventional military capability that it could have, for example, have destroyed much of Seoul, Korea, the capital city. So North Korea ended up developing itself as a nuclear power. Now the issue is with Iran. Does the West want to use force to prevent Iran from becoming another North Korea or not? Views have been divided on that. Certainly in the United States, Republicans and Democrats are divided, and Europeans. So President Trump tonight will probably try to rally everyone around the notion that this really had to be done, that as numerous senior Democratic and Republican leaders have said in recent decades, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And so President Trump will probably say he's made good on a pledge that a lot of American leaders have made.
Bill, President Trump is somebody who he was publicly quoted many times in the past criticizing the U.S. war in Iraq. And in the last several days, there are many critics of the administration who have said that they believed that the same playbook leading up to the strikes in Iran was being utilized as had been utilized in the run-up to the war on Iraq. The fact that Trump had so publicly criticized previous administrations for the U.S. war in Iraq, how would it make it easy for him to try to sell to his base now that the U.S. is now bombing Iran?
So let's remember 9/11, 2001. Prior to 9/11, President George W. Bush made quite clear numerous times that the Bush administration would not be interested in nation building in countries that were very unstable. Then 9/11 took place. Al-Qaeda was operating from Afghanistan. President George W. Bush reversed a lot of his things that he said before, and the U.S. went in to destroy Al-Qaeda and also to take down the Taliban, which had been husbanding Al-Qaeda. So sometimes presidents, for national security or other reasons, have to rise to the moment. And President Trump now probably is going to seek to portray that he has risen to the moment.
Bill, Trump posted a short while ago on his Truth Social account, Iran must now agree to end this war. How does Trump expect that Iran would come back to the table now and engage in diplomacy with the U.S. after the U.S. has taken this action? I mean, do you expect that Trump really believes that a diplomatic channel to Iran from the U.S. is open at this stage?
For several decades, the West has tried to negotiate, as I mentioned before, the elimination of the nuclear effort in Iran, and that has never succeeded, mainly because the West did not have enough leverage. For example, economic sanctions were not enough leverage to induce Iran to give up its nuclear program. So now military force is being used by Israel and the United States. Iran is much weaker militarily now. Israel has destroyed a lot of its capability, and now the U.S. is bombing the hard target sites. So Iran is much weaker than it was before. The West, the U.S., have more credibility now, more leverage, so that could change prospects for any negotiated outcome.
All right, that's Bill Courtney, who's a former U.S. ambassador and nuclear negotiator. He's also an adjunct senior fellow with the nonprofit RAND. He was joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Bill. All right, let's go now to Hamda Salhoud, who's joining us from Jordan's capital. She's in Amman because Israel's government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel and the occupied West Bank. Hamda, are we hearing anything new from Israeli officials regarding the confirmation from the U.S. that they have struck 3 nuclear sites in Iran?
Well, no official confirmation from Israeli officials, but anonymous sources have been speaking to Israeli media saying that the United States fully coordinated these airstrikes with the Israelis. They were informed about them ahead of time and that there was cooperation together on these most recent airstrikes. It's worth mentioning that there have been reports within Israeli media in the last couple of days, specifically in the last several hours leading up to these American attacks, that there was a lot of frustration on the Israeli side that they did not want to wait another 2 weeks for an American decision on whether or not they would get involved in Israel's war on Iran, saying that the Israeli prime minister never ruled out on attacking the Fordo site in Iran, the main part of their nuclear program, but that they needed American weaponry to do so because of how far underground it is. But Netanyahu still didn't rule it out. So they were hoping for American involvement. Some reports also indicate that they knew it was going to happen, but just were waiting for the green light from U.S. President Donald Trump. Israel has said that this is going to be a prolonged campaign against Iran, unlikely that it would end quickly as some had hoped. And the Israeli Army Chief of Staff had also said just within the last 36 hours that Israel had had these plans for a long time and they were just waiting for the right time to do so. saying that they had some sort of intelligence that Iran was reaching a point of no return with their nuclear program, all while negotiations were ongoing. The Americans had previously told the Iranians that they wanted some sort of deadline from them as well for the talks, but the Iranians said that they weren't going to conduct any sort of talks while they were still under Israeli fire and while there were still bombs being dropped all over Iran. So according to Israel, they say that this war is going to continue. It's going to be a long, prolonged campaign. They're going to continue targeting nuclear sites, military sites, and other sort of military and IRGC officials, and that they were going to continue conducting any sort of action that made them feel safe, even though there are still many other wars that Israel is involved in that are still open-ended and ongoing. Israel says that within the last 9 days, they have destroyed more than 1,000 Iranian drones from airstrikes, not ones that were intercepted, but from airstrikes that they had conducted across Iranian territory, saying that they're also trying to deplete their ballistic missile capabilities by bombing those arsenals as well, and by trying to kill off really any of these Iranian officials and nuclear scientists who are involved in the military and the nuclear facilities. So while there still, again, hasn't been any official reaction from the Israelis because it is past 3 a.m. local time, you can expect the Israeli Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Army Chief of Staff to come out in the coming hours in praise of this American decision, saying that they're working now in tandem to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities.
All right, that's Al Jazeera's Hamda Salhoud joining us live from Amman. Hamda, stay with us. We'll be coming back to you with more questions shortly. Let's go now back to Dorsa Jabari, who's with us here in the studio. Dorsa, of course, has reported extensively on Iran and from Iran over the years. Dorsa, I want to ask you specifically about a post from Donald Trump on his Truth Social page in which he said Iran must now agree to end this war. Obviously, we've been speaking in the last hour. Iran has been very clear that if the U.S. were to enter the fray, that essentially that would stop all diplomacy. What do we expect the Iranians to say to a post like this?
I don't think they're going to take it very seriously. I think given everything that's happened, this is the U.S. president basically forcing peace through an act of aggression on a sovereign nation. And the Iranians have been very clear, if the United States does this, then their military interests in the region and their personnel are fair targets for the Iranians. There is about 40,000 U.S. troops stationed in the Middle East. There are 19 U.S. bases in the region. 8 of them are permanent ones. And for the Iranians and their proxies, these are now legitimate targets. Now, I just want to mention that in the past few minutes, we have heard from the political deputy to Iran's state TV chief, who says that Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan have been evacuated prior to this attack. We had also heard from another high-ranking Iranian official, Mohsen Rezai. He was a former presidential candidate, and he said that all the sensitive material had been moved from the nuclear facilities. So we're getting indications of how prepared the Iranians were for this eventuality, which has now happened.
Dorsa, I want to just talk briefly about the mood inside Iran again with you. As we know, the opposition in Iran has been pretty fractured over the years. There's been a lot of speculation as to what Israeli strikes on Iran would do when it comes to the opposition, and then if the U.S. were to enter the fray, what that might do when it comes to opposition to the government. What have these attacks on Iran actually done? Has there been a rallying around the flag effect? Have people been uniting more than in the past?
Absolutely. It has completely united the entire country, the society. If there were any divisions before this, they have all been put aside. This has forced Iranians to remember, first and foremost, that they are a nation and they have to stay united in the face of this aggression. This is something Iranians have not seen since the Iran-Iraq War, which went on for 8 years between 1980 and 1988. And whatever criticism there was of the government or the system has all been forgotten or put aside, at least during this time, and really highlighted that this is a nation that stands behind the flag. And it is important for all Iranians to come together during this very difficult time. And still, Iranians are in shock of what is happening in their country. I've spoken to people who still can't believe this is unfolding. And with the U.S. now entering into this conflict, they can only imagine things are only going to get worse, not better.
Dorsa, we heard from Hamda Salhoud reporting for us from Amman a few minutes ago, and she was talking about Israeli officials and how there had been an expectation in Israel, at least behind the scenes, that the U.S. would enter the fray and would be supporting Israel's effort in Iran. Based on what you observed, based on who you've been speaking with, what you've been reporting the past 9 days or so, was there an expectation amongst Iranian officials that the U.S. actually would bomb nuclear sites in Iran?
I don't think anybody really thought it would be a reality up until maybe a few days ago. These talks in Geneva became sort of what many thought was a trap for the Iranians. It would provide an opportunity for Donald Trump to say, we tried diplomacy yet again, and they didn't accept our offer. And their offer, we have to remind our viewers, was something Iran was never going to accept. Basically to give up its entire nuclear program, which Iran has had since the 1970s, or the 60s rather. So for the United States to demand a complete surrender from the Iranians while the Israelis are carrying out strikes across the country was never going to happen. The Iranian foreign minister making it very clear in Geneva on Friday when he met with the E3, that is the foreign ministers of UK, France, and Germany, that Iran is willing to negotiate its nuclear program and have certain limits put in place, just like we saw in 2015, the nuclear deal that was signed between Iran and the world powers, which limited its nuclear program and had added transparency with the International Atomic Energy Agency in return for sanctions relief. But Donald Trump left that deal in 2018. So really, Iran has had very little trust and faith in the United States government, and that they would really uphold any deal that they'd agreed to. And then the U.S. really moved the goalposts. They had 5 rounds of discussions, negotiations between Iran and the U.S. indirectly. So that started in April. And the Americans initially said they wanted to reduce Iran's enrichment capabilities. It is currently at 60%. And Iran was willing to negotiate that. Under the 2015 nuclear deal, they agreed Iran would enrich uranium at 3.67%. And most of the uranium stockpile would not stay in the country. And the Iranians were ready to negotiate around those figures. But the Americans, about halfway through those discussions, decided, no, we now want zero enrichment in Iran. The U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff started speaking to U.S. media and saying any enrichment in Iran is unacceptable for us. And the Iranians said, well, this is not something we're going to agree to ever. It is a red line. So we started this cycle of back and forth. They had red lines, Iran had red lines, and there was no middle ground. There was no room. And the Iranians now believe, most of the officials that have been speaking, they say this was all a pretext. This was all a elaborated plan that involved Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu's ultimate goal was to strike Iran. He's been talking about this since the early 1990s, that Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat to Israel. And his aim was to do exactly what he's been doing over the past 9 days. And his ultimate goal was to get the U.S. to strike these facilities because they have the military hardware and capabilities that Israel doesn't.
Dorsa, you mentioned a moment ago that there were some Iranian officials that had suggested that the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear sites had been evacuated already prior to these strikes from the U.S. Speak to us about the level of preparation in Iran when it comes to these strikes potentially taking place. How prepared were they with these looming strikes?
I think all levels of officials within Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, once Israel started attacking Iran on June 13th, there was protocols that were followed. And first of all, they're in constant communication with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So every strike that is targeted, every nuclear facility that is targeted, it is immediately reported to the agency. The agency has inspectors that are permanently based in Iran. So if it is possible, they will check radiation levels around the facility if it's safe for them to do so. And they will report on the amount of damage or impact these strikes have had. And until now, the statements from the agency have been that there has been certain amount of damage caused, but there's no alarm in terms of radiation. And we understand that there was protocols that were followed, that Iran, the officials in Iran would have moved the sensitive material, evacuated the staff out of these facilities when the attacks began in June 13th. So that is in line with what we have been hearing over the past few days.
Dorsa, if you could just tell our viewers about where Iran's defensive capabilities lie right now. Obviously, Israel struck. There were a lot of sites that were damaged. There were a lot of reports that Iran's military and some of their military capabilities had been weakened substantially. Where do things stand right now when it comes to Iran's military and Iran's defensive capabilities?
Well, Iran maintains that it is still able to respond to Israel and also respond to the United States. There was a lot of speculation about how much Israel has managed to destroy within Iran's defensive capabilities. First, it's very difficult to verify that information. But based on what the Iranian officials have been saying, there have been sites, numerous sites targeted around the country that belong to the Defense Ministry, the Revolutionary Guards, as well as the facilities that house or that belongs to the country's defense ministry. They say, the Iranians have said that they have not sustained significant damage, and that the missiles that they continue to launch towards Israel on a daily basis is evidence that Iran is still very much able to defend itself and continue this fight, and now quite possibly expand the scope of this conflict.
And Dorsa, we were talking earlier about diplomatic channels. I mean, the U.S. seems to be indicating that they would still be open to talking to the Iranians. The Iranians, it seems pretty clear that up until this strike had said that if the U.S. strikes Iran, that meant that they weren't going to come back to the table with the U.S. going forward. Where do you think things stand diplomatically right now? Whether or not it's the U.S. speaking to Iran, are there other actors, members of the EU or other countries that could help de-escalate the situation?
I think there have been two actors that have been actively involved in trying to de-escalate. First of all, a number of countries in the Middle East, but mainly Oman and Qatar, have been playing the mediating role between Iran and the United States. We also know that Saudi Arabia has also been involved in trying to find an off-ramp in this conflict. So I think it is really up to these countries in the region that are going to possibly be directly seeing the result of any kind of an expansion in this conflict. They're going to be the ones that have to play the biggest role in trying to find a political off-ramp.
Dorsa, is there any indication at this hour from Iranian officials as to what the response will be, either militarily, politically, diplomatically, going forward, the response to this strike from the U.S.?
We haven't heard anything yet officially. You have to remember it is the middle of the night in Iran, so we're still waiting for official reaction and confirmation from the Iranian officials. But they have made it very clear in the past, on all levels of officials, political officials, diplomatic officials, military officials, even the president himself has said that if the United States does exactly what they did tonight, Iran will respond with a military response. So, and the U.S. interest in the regions would be the target.
And Dorsa, the Iranians have been clear that if the U.S. were to take this action, that they would retaliate by targeting potentially U.S. bases in the region. How much concern is there amongst Iranian officials about what kind of response that action would provoke going forward?
Well, there's a certain understanding that Iran has to respond to this act by the United States, this act of aggression, and they will call it an act of war. Their response, the level of response, is going to have to be decided, basically, by the commander-in-chief in Iran, that is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And given everything that's happened with what Israel has been carrying out inside Iran, it is unlikely that the response would be a muted one. We have seen the response towards the Iranian missiles and drones towards Israel over the past 9 days. We have seen Iran targeting various military, energy, and sensitive infrastructures inside Israel and the occupied territories. So it is going to be likely that the Iranians will have to show force when it comes to responding to the Americans.
All right, Dorsa, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed and for breaking that all down for us. We appreciate it. Please stay with us. We'll be coming back to you for more details going forward. All right, Shahram Akbarzadeh is the director of the Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University in Australia. He's also a non-resident senior fellow with the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha. He joins us now live from Melbourne. Sir, thank you for being with us here on Al Jazeera. Let me ask you first, based on what you're seeing at this hour, this type of escalation, the fact that the U.S. has entered the conflict and struck these 3 nuclear sites inside Iran, where does that put things geopolitically, and how much does that bring up the heat in the Middle East right now?
Well, thanks for having me, Mohammed. This is obviously a very dangerous turn of events. President Trump has stepped on a very slippery slope here. There were only 24 hours prior to this. There were negotiations, there were talks in Geneva between Iran and 3 European powers. And the end result was that European powers suggested that there's a scope for a diplomatic solution to now turn around and bomb nuclear facilities in Iran has basically made the United States a target for Iran. So Iran will feel obligated and really in a corner to respond to this attack, and that could be devastating for the region, devastating.
Shahram, where do you see things going forward in the hours and the days ahead? I mean, what kind of response do you anticipate from Iran?
I think Iran will try a 2-track approach. The first track would be appealing to international law, international institutions. The attack, Iran will argue, is illegal and under international law illegitimate. In fact, the Israeli attack, Iran argues, is illegal and an assault on Iranian sovereignty. So that's going to be an argument that Iran puts forward at the United States. And Iran has the support of Russia, China, and many other countries that agree with. The second option that Iran is also very likely to pursue at the same time is to get back at U.S. and also utilize its various proxies and allies in the region to hit at U.S. assets. So what Iran is going to pursue, is very likely to pursue, puts the whole region at risk.
All right, that's Shahram Akbarzadeh, who's the director of the Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University in Australia. Thanks so much for joining.
For exclusive and latest news, like, share, and subscribe to American News Channel USA YouTube channel.
Conflict between Israel and Iran. President Trump is talking to the press at the G7, and we are monitoring that for any big news. In the meantime, let's go to Mike Tobin. He can give us a quick catch-up from Tel Aviv. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Dana. Iran is now interested in de-escalation and a return to the negotiating table with the condition that the U.S. stays out of the fight. The U.S., for its part, is now sending the USS Nimitz carrier strike group to the region ahead of schedule. There was a strike during a live broadcast of Iranian state TV, and what I can show you now is video of the aftermath of the state TV building in Tehran on fire. Israel, for its part, did send a warning into the area, warning people to evacuate ahead of that strike. State TV is now back on the air broadcasting from a backup location. Israel's prime minister says Israeli jets can now do whatever they want in the skies over Tehran.
The Israeli Air Force controls the skies over Tehran. This changes the entire campaign. We are on the way to achieving our two goals, eliminating the nuclear threat and eliminating the missile threat.
We have new video out of Iranian F-14s on the ground being taken out by Israeli airstrikes. Iran purchased those F-14s before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. We also have satellite images of missile production and nuclear facilities before and after Israeli airstrikes. Israel says 1/3 of Iran's missile launchers have now been destroyed. But thus far, they haven't materialized. It doesn't mean they won't.
With world leaders at the G7 in Canada, and once.
And they should talk, and they should talk immediately before.
Israel do what it thinks it needs to do to protect itself.
Right. So we're pretty involved already. We greenlit the operation, obviously. We're intercepting all the missiles that Iran's sending over, and we have shared intelligence and are doing refueling flights. The question is, how much more involved are we going to get? And so a few scenarios. One, if the Iranians attack U.S. assets, we'll have to get involved. The question is whether we're going to give or use bunker-busting bombs to completely eliminate the Iranian nuclear program, or if we'll authorize regime change strikes against the leadership. And I think the balance that Trump's trying to strike is you can't allow the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. It's been almost 100 years of U.S. policy, non-proliferation. You can't get blackmailed by rogue states. But also, you can't have regime change wars, and those have unintended consequences. So if you were to have a decapitation strike against the Iranian leadership, what comes next? Because it's a theocracy, and you have 30,000 radical Muslim clerics that are still there. You can't kill all of them. So does it break down into militia factions where they all just kill each other? Do we install somebody? Do people come from all over the region with guns? Is there an insurgency? No one knows. And so the Israelis have their own agenda. They want this guy gone. Now, does that agenda jive with our agenda? Maybe not, because they're not going to be the ones to manage the chaos. We're going to have to manage the chaos, and they know that, and that's fine. But we've already overthrown an Iranian leader before. We installed the Shah, and he was a great ally for many years, and he pumped oil, and he was fantastic against the Soviets, but he was so unpopular, he was overthrown by these even more fundamental radical people who we're still dealing with today. The big question is the Iranian nuke deal still possible? Now, the Israelis say no. They call them fake talks. They think they're going nowhere, and we're getting strung along. Donald Trump disagrees. He thinks there can be a deal that is put together. And at this point, the Iranians have no leverage. And so it looks like they're kind of begging to come back to the negotiating table. And Donald Trump isn't ready to do the deal yet. I think he's going to let the Israeli military continue to soften up Iranian targets as they finally limp back to the negotiation table and swear off enrichment. And that would be a great outcome if they swear off enrichment. But I don't know if that's even possible, because the Iranians saw what happened to Gaddafi. Remember, after Saddam was toppled, Gaddafi was like, all right, we'll get rid of the nukes. And the next thing you know, Hillary and the Europeans came in and took him out. So very delicate situation. The next couple of days will be pretty serious.
And the IAEA, which I guess it's basically the international organization that checks on nuclear enrichment, just last week, that Iran is in total non-compliance, Harold. And at the same time, the Israelis said, we underestimated our enemy on October 7th, and we can't afford to do it again because they're closer than ever to a nuclear weapon. So now the stage is set. In the meantime, though, Israel has 53 hostages still in Gaza.
So good to be back around the table. Hope everyone had a productive and happy Father's Day weekend. Jesse, you framed it fairly well. I think the only thing I would add to what you eloquently said is two things. First, we're going to be confronted as a nation very soon with whether or not we should provide the wherewithal and the resources. We're the ones with the munition and that bunker-busting bomb that you talked about that would be used to blow up a half a mile under earth there, the mountain that we've identified, that the Israelis have identified. I'm a believer that we should, if the Israelis believe that's what's needed to put an end to this. I listened to Mr. Netanyahu, who I'm not always a fan of, but I listened to him on Sunday and had a chance to react to him on Brett Baer's show. Brett did a really good interview. I thought Mr. Netanyahu was convincing. He made 2 points there. He said, first, the slumber of democracy, he invoked Churchill talking about when democracies get lazy, they get content. This is when these kind of evil things happen. We have a moment here to stop this. He also spoke to the Iranian people and spoke to the Persian people and said, look, the Israelis and the Persian people have had a great relationship over many centuries. There's no reason going forward, if we get past this ugly and unfortunate chapter, that we can't do the same going forward. Now, I understand, Dana, some of the concerns that Democrat and Republican politicians, including some supporters of President Trump, have about broadening this war, because the real risk here is the escalation of the war. Jack Keane said something I thought very, very telling over the weekend as well, and even repeated on our network today. He said that the Army, Navy, and Air Force of the Iranians have been diminished and weakened, and that the leadership of their Army, Navy, and Air Force are diminished and poor as well. And if we're thinking about the moment in a way to put an end to this, this might be the moment to do it. I remember when there were those who were saying we should have supplied more support and more resources for the Ukrainians against the Russians. President Trump often says that had he been president, that never would have happened. Russia would have never invaded Ukraine. And I assume he meant that he would have provided more resources and tools for the Ukrainians. I think we're at that moment now, Dana, with this Iranian-Israeli conflict. I don't want a broadening of the conflict. I don't want an escalation. I think the president of Turkey and others are right. We're on a precipice. But what I don't want to have happen going forward is this risk and threat that the Iranians pose. And what you led into this question about, they have lied about their preparation, their ability to develop and detonate a nuclear weapon. I don't want that. And even if the IAEA is wrong, I'm willing to take the risk. If we have this moment now, we should destroy this capability of the Iranians.
Kennedy, I feel like President Trump doesn't get credit for something else. It's a key part of the story, but it's a smaller part of the story. And it's that, first of all, Israel did degrade the capabilities of Hezbollah and Hamas. And then you have President Trump in the Middle East just 2 weeks ago, making friends, making allies, and recognizing the new Syrian government to the point that yesterday, or when this started 4 days ago, Lebanon said, we're staying out of it. And then Syria yesterday said, you can use our airspace. And if you just hold that thought, because we have a new sound from President Trump, he was just asked about the possibility of regime change in Iran, and we can listen to that, and then we'll come back around to Kennedy.
I want to see no nuclear weapon in Iran, and we're well on our way to making sure that happens.
And a short comment, Kennedy, I wasn't sure how long that would be. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think he shares that sentiment with the entire Western world. No one wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon because, you know, this is not the era of détente, of mutually assured destruction, where, you know, there were countries stockpiling nuclear weapons for defensive reasons. Iran has talked about going on the offense, and part of the existence of this regime is the desire to annihilate Israel, you know, which is right next door. Think about it. What if Canada what if the reason for being for Canada was to destroy and obliterate the United States? I was recently on a Holocaust tour in Poland, and we visited the extermination camps. And, you know, that took years for Nazi Germany to exterminate 6 million Jews and 3 million Catholic Poles. Iran wants to do what Hitler started with one bomb, and that's the fear. So Israel has started this, and now what the United States has to ask itself, are we going to be the ones who finish it? Because it will, if you're talking about the main enriching site for uranium, the Fordel site, that will take the kind of bunker buster that Israel does not have. I spoke to a former Navy SEAL senior chief, and he said, yes, Israel does have bunker busting bombs, but not the massive type where it'll take a pair with a B-2 bomber in order to completely obliterate that facility. That is a possibility if the United States wants to get involved. Iran does not want the U.S. to get involved because they know it is not only the end of their nuclear program, but also their petroleum program as well. So what does Iran have left? What they're clinging on to now is the desperate hope they will, with some of their other Middle East partners, be able to move forward capitalistic in a way that takes them out of petroleum, but into the economic future. They can't do that as an authoritarian, theocratic regime relying solely on oil.
Greg Gutfeld.
This is a tough one. You know, is Trump's actions a violation of the Trump doctrine, which is America first? I think that's the debate that's kind of raging among the right. But because you trust him, he's been on everything, pretty much everything here and there. He's directionally consistent. For him being for any wars, he was outspoken about most of them. So I think to say, oh, now he's a neocon is unfair. He wouldn't do this unless he thought it had to be done. So you kind of have to give him the benefit of the doubt, which you cannot do with Iran. Iran is like the T-1000, in the second Terminator movie. You knock it down, you knock down its nuclear capabilities, and it reconstitutes itself. And so your only hope is that you make the time it takes to reconstitute longer and longer. You're not kicking the can down the road. And it's like whether or not you want to do it now, you have to weigh the benefits. I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but, it's all about frame of reference. This is not going to happen again. If Israel was around before, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. But then the other frame of reference is Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. We were promised an end to that. So somehow you've got to start fresh with this and try to push the backstory of history off on the side. I don't know if that's possible, but, if you're going to trust somebody, I would trust Trump and not Iran. That's where I'm at.
In addition, about all of this happening and not unhappy about it, as reported, apparently. Okay.
Click here to subscribe to the... And as Eric mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz may close, and in fact, oil futures are spiking in reaction to the turmoil in the Middle East, and investors do fear that Iran would disrupt what is global shipping via the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that channel is the only way to ship crude oil from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. 20% of the world's oil passes through the strait. Any disturbance will have a significant impact on the global economy. Only Iran's National Security Council has the authority to close the strait. CBS News contributor Javier David joins us now to talk more about this. He's the business editor for the Dallas Morning News. Javier, good morning to you. What would happen if this decision is made in Iran to close the strait? What would happen next?
Yeah, look, we have a sort of a war on two fronts now. We've got one that's policy-based. It's all about the tariffs and the trade war. And now we have this armed conflict that is spurring the price of oil. So just to throw some numbers at you, Brent crude at the start of the month was trading around $62 a barrel. We've now built in a quote-unquote war premium of about 30% to nearly $80. So commodity investors are kind of having the best time that they've had since the start of the year, but these are real economic risks associated with this. So, you'll see more than likely a lot of analysts are building in the possibility of a run at $80 a barrel, $90 a barrel, perhaps even above $100 a barrel. And under the most extreme scenarios, that adds about $1 per gallon to gas and diesel prices. So these are real and sustained risks.
And we see gas prices usually increase in some cases over the summer, in many cases anyway, just because of the increased demand. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it would be economic suicide, though, for Iranians to shut down the strait. That would be an expected reaction. How likely is it to happen, do you think?
Well, look, this is a very high likelihood. Iran was blindsided and really humiliated by these strikes. They're vowing to make the West, in particular the U.S., pay the price. The easiest way to do that is, of course, through the price of oil and energy prices. But luckily for us, this isn't the 1970s anymore. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer. We still import oil internationally. It's not nearly as damaging as it could have been if we were still wholly dependent on foreign crude. So we're far more energy independent and secure these days. It doesn't totally insulate us from shocks, but it does help us blunt the sharper edges of what could happen.
Yeah, other nations have diversified as well. I mean, India, for example, has moved away from Middle Eastern sources of oil while adding others to the mix. We know that global markets are open this morning. Do you see any trends right now that might be a signal for the U.S. of what kind of week this will be?
Yeah, ongoing concerns. We talk a lot about oil now, but don't forget about the tariffs, and that has all been a very real concern about global growth. So you have these two things working at cross purposes. The tariffs are bad for global demand. They're bad for growth. But in the very short term, we're going to see a lot of volatility in the price of crude and in other energy prices that filter in. It's just not a good for the outlook in terms of our ability to manage all of these crises at once.
All right, Javier David with the latest economic headlines on this major story. Thanks so much.
The United States and Iran have one of the world's most complicated and controversial relationships. The United States is the world's most preeminent superpower with a population of more than 320 million, while Iran is a major power in her own right, with a population of more than 80 million. These countries represent 4% and 1% of the living human population. And for the past 41 years, they've had absolutely zero diplomatic relations and have come close to the brink of one occasion. At the beginning of 2020, war between the major general in a drone strike, and Iran retaliated American military bases across Iraq. Had a war broken out for World War, this time that fate got to understand the entire history of the conflict before the start of World War II. At the beginning of the 20th the British, as more and more of these discoveries were made, it was revealed largest proven reserves of oil anywhere on the planet, and that the country was an undestabilized energy superpower. The only problem for the British, of course, Iran wasn't within Britain's vast colonial empire that already spanned a quarter of the Britain negotiated a deal with Iran to share in the massive profits owned Anglo-Iranian oil company, but it wasn't exactly actually located, was only entitled to 16% of the company's profits. The Anglo-Iranian oil company grew to control all the British Empire, but this massively valuable asset was coming under threats. Time in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. In human history, Iran stood geographically at the Soviet considered suspect by both the British and the Soviets. Despite having declared neutrality at the onset of the war, Iran's ruling Shah, or emperor, was widely considered by the Allies to be too friendly towards the Nazis. If Iran were to have cooperated with the Axis, it could have opened up another southern front for the Soviets to deal with that would have diverted vital troops away from the critical Eastern Front. It could have jeopardized the Soviet Union's own oil fields in the Caucasus right on Iran's doorstep, and it would have potentially placed Britain's largest oil company in the hands of the Nazis. So in order to prevent any of that from happening, and in order to ensure that Iran could be used as a transportation corridor to get vital supplies into the Soviet Union, neutral Iran was invaded by both the Soviets and the British. Vastly outnumbered and far behind in technology, Iran never stood a chance and surrendered within just a week. The old troublesome Shah was overthrown and replaced by the invaders with his much younger 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whom the Allies felt would be far less capable of acting against their interests. Iran was effectively occupied for the entire Second World War by the Allies, which eventually saw the deployment of more than 30,000 Americans and the transportation of nearly 1/3 of all the supplies that America sent to the Soviet Union. After the war ended, the Allies left and ended their occupation, but the unfair terms that the British had established in regards to Iran's oil came back into question. By the early 1950s, Britain was still taking home the majority of Iran's oil profits, while the conditions for Iranian oil workers and their families remained terrible. At the same time, the British were also withholding all of the company's financial records from the Iranians, and had refused all of their requests at being audited. The support for nationalizing the company within Iran was getting overwhelmingly massive, and by 1951, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, with unanimous approval from the Iranian parliament, finally did so. Britain responded to this by immediately embargoing all Iranian oil, and then 2 years later, in 1953, Britain's MI6 and America's CIA organized a military coup within the country to overthrow Mossadegh's government. As many as 300 Iranians were killed during the coup. Mossadegh himself was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, while the Shah was elevated to being essentially an authoritarian dictator within the country. Having had his position installed and guaranteed by Western powers twice now, the Shah became widely viewed in Iran as little more than a Western puppet. And as the Cold War developed out of the ashes of the Second World War, Iran's strategic location at the Soviet Union's southern flank, her vast strategic reserves of oil, and her authoritarian leader who owed his position and loyalty to the West, made Iran a natural and valuable ally of the United States for the very first time. The Shah pursued a staunchly pro-American and pro-Israel foreign policy, and for decades, Iran became one of America's most important Cold War-era allies. But over the decades, the Shah's policies and cozy relations with the West alienated much of his home base support. He ran a vast network of secret police within the country who arrested thousands of political opponents, and many more, like Ayatollah Khomeini, were exiled. Widespread torture of political dissidents in prison was reported. He outlawed the Iranian Communist Party. He continued friendly relations with both America and Israel, despite nearly none of the rest of the Islamic world even recognizing Israel, while he carried out a domestic policy of modernization, secularism, and the enfranchisement of women. All of these policies combined alienated Iran's leftists, the working class, and the hardcore Shiite Muslim conservatives and clergy, and by the late 1970s, political unrest had transformed into flaming Marxist and Islamist own secret police. The following month, protests fire on them indiscriminately, killing and wounding. After defections from his army became rampant, Mohammed and he fled the country in exile in early replaced the Shah's regime, immediately abolished the monarch to become Iran's new supreme leader. And this new Iranian regime was radically different to the United States and Israel, and met out to the United States and the rest of the world. Iran had flipped from being one of America's most important to their country for a cancer treatment operation to stand trial for the crimes that he had committed throughout his reign against the execution. The United States rejected all of Iran inside America. Previous coups in the past to install 79 thousands of Iranian revolutionaries and students and civilians as hostages. America eventually sent the Shah away to Egypt, while the Carter administration worked for months to secure the hostages' release. But when diplomacy went nowhere, Carter authorized a raid by the United States Army Rangers in April of 1980 to attempt a rescue operation. But the raid turned into a disaster. Codenamed Operation Eagle Claw, a helicopter crashed into contact with the Iranians was even made, and 8 United States decided to sever all diplomatic Iran's new regime, and they have been frozen ever since. But a few months later, something else incredible and unexpected happened. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's all-out invasion of conquest on. For years preceding this, Saddam had wanted Iraq to overtake and supplant Iran as the dominant power in the oil-rich Persian Gulf. But they were never capable of doing anything about it, because Iran had a colossally larger military, and they had the support of America and Israel, all of which made her vastly more powerful. After Iran was thrown into chaos by her revolution and regime change, with massive purges and executions of government officials, and after she was abandoned by both America and Israel and was left without any major foreign allies, Saddam calculated that now was better than ever to take advantage and attack. Iraq expected a rapid victory, but the war that followed turned into an 8-year-long stalemate that most resembled the Western Front of World War I. After the massive Iraqi invasion, Iran was forced to reevaluate the American hostage situation, and they agreed to release all 52 back into U.S. custody after holding them for 444 days. America levied heavy economic sanctions upon Iran as a consequence, and then began heavily supplying Saddam and Iraq in their war effort that they hoped would destabilize Iran even further. The Iran-Iraq War of the 20th century's second half, with as many as 4 United States. Throughout the war, the U.S. carried out a bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, which killed 17 Americans, and later that same year, they carried out another massive truck bombing attack against the barracks of a military compound in Lebanon, which killed a further 241 58 French soldiers. These events and others contributed to the United States placing Iran on their state sponsors of terrorism list the following year in 1984. By April of 1988, the Iran-Iraq War was still raging, and Iran had mined a large section of the Persian Gulf in order to counter the Iraqi Navy. An American frigate who happened to be passing through struck one of these mines and became severely damaged and almost sank, but with no loss of life. Regardless, America decided to initiate a retaliatory attack against Iranian targets and initiated Operation Praying Mantis. It was the largest U.S. naval combat operation seen since the Second World War, and it saw 2 American surface groups launching coordinated strikes that blew up 2 Iranian offshore oil platforms and sank 6 of their warships. The attack destroyed or severely damaged half of Iran's entire fleet and killed 56 Iranians, while resulting in only 2 American deaths. Just 3 months in July of 1988, an American cruiser strayed into Iranian territory 655 that was taking its normal flight. Identified this commercial aircraft as an Iranian fighter aboard that flight, and 250-pound incident in history until the horrible events between both sides sharply escalated to Iran by any American-based company and Air Force personnel and wounding nearly 5 bombs. Iraq and North Korea altogether. No weapons of mass destruction were ever uncovered, and their own nuclear weapons research as well. However, the United States, known colloquially as the Iran nuclear deal, they had previously placed upon Iran, while Iran agreed to give his relationship was beginning to show some signs of rapprochement. Donald Trump was elected the new president of the United States. Withdraw the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal and to reinstate tougher economic sanctions. In 2018, Trump carried through with these campaign promises, and Iran counter-threatened that they would continue on with their nuclear program and even close the Strait of Hormuz to international shipping if things escalated any further, which would have completely crashed the global oil economy. Relations between the two were back to being tense, and then things got even worse the next year. In May and June of 2019, several merchant ships traveling through the Persian Gulf were damaged in 2 separate violent incidents. The West blamed Iran, and then Iran denied all involvement. In June, Iran shot down an American drone that was flying over the Strait of Hormuz, and tensions increased even further. And then in July, an Iranian oil tanker was seized by the UK as it was passing through the Strait of Gibraltar on the grounds that it was shipping oil to the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, in direct violation of EU sanctions. Iran countered this by capturing a British oil tanker and taking its crew hostage, as it was later other ships and crew, but it was clear that tension dead and 4 other soldiers wounded. About 5,000 U.S. troops who were stationed helping in the ongoing fight against ISIL, and 2 days later on the 29th, they decided to initiate a retaliatory strike against Hezbollah's weapons depots and command centers across both Iraq and Syria. These American airstrikes killed 25 Hezbollah-affiliated militiamen and wounded nearly 60 others. Escalating things even further a couple days after that, on December the 31st, Iran-backed militiamen stormed and attacked the United States Embassy in Baghdad. The embassy was heavily vandalized, but nobody on either side was killed, and the US blamed Iran once again for the provocation. And then came the 3rd of January 2020, when the already to levels never seen before. Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian major general widely believed to be the second most powerful figure within the Iranian regime, had just arrived in Baghdad on a flight. He was scheduled to meet with Iraq's prime minister later on in the day, but as he departed the Baghdad airport in a convoy of vehicles, a U.S. drone that had been hovering nearby overhead fired a series of missiles that completely destroyed them. This missile strike had been personally authorized and ordered by President Donald Trump himself, and resulted in the deaths of Soleimani and 9 others. This event profoundly changed the crisis between Iran and the United States. It was the first time that America had assassinated a major military leader of a major foreign country since the plot to kill Isoroku Yamamoto of the Japanese Imperial Navy back in 1943, who had been the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attacks. 2 days later, Iran announced that it would no longer abide by any of the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal and demanded that Iraq remove all of the American presence from their country. And then, on the 8th of January, 5 days after Soleimani's death, Iran launched its own retaliatory strike against America. Codenamed Operation Martyr Soleimani, Iran initiated multiple ballistic missile strikes against 2 U.S. military bases within Iraq, and the entire world held its breath. This was the closest that America and Iran had ever come to full-scale war, and the crisis could have easily escalated into that. America had already rapidly deployed thousands of soldiers to the Persian Gulf from the U.S. East Coast in the days between Soleimani's death and this Iranian artillery attack, but thankfully, nobody was killed by it. The bases experienced significant damage to buildings and infrastructure, but everybody present remained alive. And this was sort of a godsend because it gave both Iran and America the opportunity to de-escalate without losing any face. Iran got to look strong and powerful by firing rockets at American targets, and without any casualties, America was given the option not to retaliate. It's what they chose to do. Unfortunately, though, tragedy still managed to find a way to strike. While Iran likely designed the attack intentionally to not cause any American casualties, Iran didn't necessarily know that the US wasn't going to retaliate, and their anti-air batteries across the country were on high alert for any kind of response. One batteries detected what they believed to be an American cruise missile on their radar, and they opened fire on it with 2 surface-to-air missiles. It turned out that the target wasn't a cruise missile at all, but was just a regularly scheduled commercial taken off from Tehran International Airport minutes before. The plane in question was Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, traveling from Tehran to Kiev with 176 people on board. The Iranian missiles completely destroyed the plane and killed everybody on board, including 82 Iranian and 63 Canadian citizens. Initially, the Iranian government denied all responsibility and attempted to cover the disaster up by blaming the crash on technical faults with the plane itself. But after raising suspicion when they wouldn't allow any investigators access to the crash site, the government finally admitted to mistakenly shooting the plane down a few days later on January 11th. That attempted cover-up sparked massive protests across Iran and against the regime, and the brink of war against the United States had just narrowly been avoided. Hundreds of innocent people died as a result of the conflict between Iran and the United States in 2020. But of course, it could have always been far worse. Had the conflict escalated by any number of countless different ways, all-out war could have broken out that would have resulted in the deaths of many, many more. I only hope that peace between my country and Iran can be maintained in the future, but at the same time, I'm aware of how precarious this peace is and the history behind all of this, and I'm fearful that one day in the future, we might not get as relatively lucky as we did at the beginning of 2020.
This video was originally released on Nebula as a part of my exclusive Modern Conflict series nearly 4 years ago in September of 2021. A lot has happened between the United States and Iran since then, which is why I decided to release this video on YouTube now.
The truce between Israel and Iran appears to be holding for now, hours after he set off for the NATO summit this morning. The president swore in front of reporters as his frustration, particularly at Israel, boiled over. You'll hear in full what he had to say in a moment. Tonight, Donald Trump has been warmly welcomed in The Hague, where NATO leaders have sat down to dinner at the start of the two-day summit on defence. It comes, though, as questions are now being raised in the United States about just how successful the American airstrikes were on Iran's nuclear facilities. Here's America editor Sarah Smith.
Israel launched a barrage of airstrikes on Tehran as the ceasefire deadline approached, also striking Iranian missile launchers in a last-minute all-out assault. Donald Trump was furious with both Iran and particularly Israel for not respecting the deal.
I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because the one rocket that didn't land, that was shot.
We often see President Trump exasperated, but never actually swearing like this.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Understand that Israel has pushed him too far this time, just when he's on his way to take a victory lap at a NATO summit in The Hague, but only if the truce holds. He posted on social media, Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it's a major violation. Bring your pilots home now. Then from onboard Air Force One, in a call to the Israeli Prime Minister, which the White House described as exceptionally firm and direct, Trump demanded he stick to the ceasefire. And then posted again saying, Israel is not going to attack Iran. All planes will turn around and head home while doing a friendly plane wave to Iran. Nobody will be hurt. The ceasefire is in effect.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be with a friend of mine.
The NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, is hosting Donald Trump in The Hague tonight. They get on well, but he might be very surprised to find the text messages he sent praising the president posted on social media. He wrote, Mr. President, dear Donald, congratulations and thank you for your decisive action in Iran. That was truly extraordinary, something no one else dared to do. It makes us all safer.
About aggression by
On Air Force One, Mr. Trump is already talking about his desire to agree a ceasefire in Ukraine.
You know, I'd like to see a deal with Russia. As you know, Vladimir called me up. He said, can I help you with Iran? I said, no, I don't need help with Iran. I need help with you.
Donald Trump loves a grand VIP welcome, arriving at the Royal Palace. NATO leaders talking to them about spending more on their own defense, what he considers to be his crowning achievement in the Middle East. It's being reported here that those American airstrikes on Iran might not have done as much damage to their nuclear facility as Donald Trump claimed when he said they had been completely obliterated. And that the core components of Iran's nuclear program may not have been destroyed, and that much of their enriched uranium stockpiles could have been moved to secret sites. The White House are very angry about that. They've pushed back saying this is flat wrong. The press knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their, she said, but they're not saying the Defense Department assessment.
North America editor, thank you. Well, Israel and Iran had launched large night. In Iran, targets were hit in the capital Tehran and in the northern region of Gilad. 16 people were killed. In Israel, the southern city of Beersheba was hit. From Jerusalem, Lucy Williamson reports.
Iran announced its commitment to peace. 5 minutes before Iran agreed to the several people in
targeted towards civilian buildings like this.
I think Israel need to hit back Iran. Iran said peace, but there is no peace.
Came in, warning of more missiles fired from Iran. But Israeli planes on their way to retaliate vowed to act against any new.
And if anyone in Iran tries to revive this, any such attempt, I repeat, Iran will not have nuclear weapons.
Iran still has the capability to fire missiles at Israel and has warned of a powerful right in Tehran. Protesters call.
Just like what happened in Gaza and Lebanon.
Iran will avenge the people you killed, said Suhaila. One day we'll catch you off guard. Be sure of that. In northern Israel today, a souvenir from 12 days of conflict. An interceptor used in Israel's air defenses. Israel says this short war has made the region safer by weakening Iran as a military threat. But it's weakened the regime as well. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Beersheba.